Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku born with gift Quirk. If you guys enjoy this movie, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story fitzefitcher from 𝐬𝐻. So let's start the video. Izuku is born without any gifts, as his kind often are, to a witch mother and salamander father, on one sweltering night in July. It's an auspicious birth, to be born beneath a full moon at the height of summer, a perfect setting for both parents. The sky bright with the moon and stars and a damp heat saturating the air, and the midwife says his potential is promising, especially with a father of such power, and doesn't say much of the weakness in his mother's bloodline, of his dark, wild hair. He'll be a fire breather, certainly, the midwife assures them. His spots have already appeared, and they'll turn to stars before long. Hisashi puffs with expectant pride, and 𝐀𝐦 only wishes for her child's happiness. Nevertheless, Izuku is born without any gifts, and his freckles remain just that, freckles. They do not turn to anything, not stars, not embers, not anything. Sometimes, spots are just spots, and no amount of hoping or wishing will change that. Izuku receives his first gift when he's about 4 years old. This is also when he hears the word changeling for the first time, and comes to understand what that means. It means he has no gifts of his own, and probably never will, according to the physician. It means he will not be a fire breather. He will not be a magic user. He will not be anything at all. It means the growing discontent of his father. It means his mother's endless guilt. And it means the increasing amount of stares he, his father, and mother all receive in public, whether pitying or curious or downright malicious. It means he is a mistake, an ill-fitting replacement for the child meant to be here in his stead. And this is knowledge no child, however young, should ever have. His father does not linger, and his mother throws herself into caring for him so much that it doesn't matter. He does not remember much of his father, and doesn't care to. His spots will remain spots, and there's nothing wrong with that. Raising a giftless child will be difficult, everyone seems to tell his mother. Particularly by herself in a house she will shortly be unable to afford. But she will let nothing stand in the way of her child's happiness, if she can help it, magic or no magic. The neighborhood children don't seem to care too much, yet, having not yet come into their powers themselves. In particular, a little boy wolf takes to Izuku, and leads him all around town in a little pack of his own, made up of other children in the neighborhood. He doesn't say it, but Izuku appears to be his favorite by a wide margin. He always picks Izuku first in their games, and teases him the most, but will not allow the other children to pick on him, and forces them to share their toys, even if he won't share his own. He doesn't like to share, 𝐀𝐦 thinks, watching him dote on Izuku in the same breath. He's teasing him, pushing the other children away if they come too close. 𝐀𝐦, his name is, and he'll probably grow into a fine young wolf, should he keep that pride and temper in check. His mother a wolf as well, the alpha of her own pack, and his father a fire demon. Sometimes they play guardians and hunters, sometimes they play monsters, but Izuku is always his partner, regardless of what side they're on, and together they always win, much to the chagrin of the other children. They play all day with each other and the other children, and spend afternoons and evenings watching video clippings of their favorite guardians. Both of them favor Yagi the most, but the rankings after that wildly differ, more than once falling asleep on the couch in Izuku's living room, or the one in 𝐀𝐦's, and waking up in their own beds. Izuku begins to take notes on his favorites, cataloging their abilities and skills and how they would face off against the others, and it grows from there into 𝐀𝐦's favorites, and then their rivals, and eventually Izuku is taking notes on every guardian and hunter he sees. Izuku spends all of 𝐀𝐦's full moons with him, the boy wolf climbing in through his window with nascent claws and surging strength, and curling up next to him on his bed, very nearly on top of him. Izuku cannot defend himself the way he is now, and there are many who would prey upon changelings, to actively seek them out and hunt them, especially on the full moon when not only wolves roam the night. And so, 𝐀𝐦 takes it upon himself to protect him. He's not sure that his parents allow this exactly, or if he merely escapes while they aren't looking. He doesn't doubt that he could. When told he can't do something, Katsuki will go out of his way to make it so, if only out of spite. Izuku keeps his window open for him after the first time, and every full moon thereafter is greeted with Katsuki in his wolf skin, climbing up the side of his house and into his bedroom. There's no need to keep the window closed when the weather begins to cool. He radiates heat, and can keep the both of them warm well enough on his own. There's no fire in his mane yet, but there's no doubt that there will be once he's old enough, and sparks already fly from it. So, Izuku keeps his window open for the full moon well through autumn and winter, and Katsuki never fails to appear for each one. Katsuki already shows the signs of becoming an alpha himself, despite being so young, and bonds with Izuku far more than either of their parents expected. He already plans the future for them, red eyes aglow with excitement over how they'll be guardians, not just that, but the greatest ones this world has ever seen. And Izuku starts tearing up because he can't. He'll never be able to. The way he is now, Katsuki learns of his father's leaving, and consequently of his giftlessness, and burns with fury on his behalf, sparks flying from his hair and skin. It was wrong to abandon your pack. It was wrong to abandon your mate. And Katsuki will tear out his treacherous father's throat with his own teeth. That is a promise. You can live with us, he tells him, fervent in his affection. You can be pack. We'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. I'll make you into something. I'll make you into one of us. A noble thought it may be, with the intention of making Izuku's nothing into something, taking his presumed weakness and leaving strength in its stead. But Izuku is not nothing, and cannot be unmade. Were he actually a changeling, it would have worked, certainly. Despite Katsuki's youth, he already holds a power of his own. But Izuku is not a changeling. Izuku is not anything they've ever seen. I will not abandon you, he tells Izuku, as fierce as any boy can be. On the eve of a full moon in spring, the boy wolf, now 5 and Izuku a few months shy of it, Katsuki gives Izuku his first gift. He bites him, marking up his shoulder with sharp little teeth, and intends to give him the blood of a wolf, so that he will never be alone again. But this is what he gives him instead. He gives him his strength and loyalty. He gives him his endurance, and enough of his fire so that no frost will ever harm him. No winter will ever take him from Katsuki. He gives him too much, in fact. He gives him his fire, and Izuku nearly dies. Inko comes running upon hearing her child's plaintive cries, and upon seeing Katsuki, mouth full of blood in her son's room, while her son lies on the floor and whimpers, scruffs him and attempts to throw him out, uncaring of any of his grand schemes. But Katsuki will not be moved, snarling, screaming, "No, no, you don't understand. I need to be here. He needs me." And Inko has more important things to care about than the angry tears of a wolf cub, so Katsuki stays through the night. He stays through Izuku's fevered delirium until the early hours of the morning, when his mother has returned from her hunt and finally learns of her son's foolishness. Mitsuki by no means is pleased to find her son here, whining in his throat and clinging to Izuku like that alone will stop the fever in its tracks, will stop the wound from oozing blood far longer than it should. And she and her husband drag their screaming son back to their home down the street after apologizing profusely to Inko and offering her their help. Inko declines and shuts herself and her son in their home until the fever breaks. In the days that follow, Inko pours all of herself into keeping her son alive. She weeps over her son and prays, pleads, begs anyone who is listening, please, let Izuku live, let the fever break, let this illness pass. She does not let the wolves back into her home, despite how Katsuki howls at the doors and windows whenever he gets the chance. She's sure that he only meant to help, but she does not have the capacity to forgive currently, nor does she want to. She blocks out all outside influences and focuses only on Izuku. This is how he receives his second gift. Whomever had said that Inko's bloodline was weak had been misinformed. Not weak, so much as not utilized correctly. It was true, certainly, that were a number of powerful magicians in her ancestry, and that over time their power had dwindled, at least as far as more aggressive spell work went. But the truth of the matter is, it had merely poured itself into other talents instead. It turned itself inward and focused on healing rather than hurt, water rather than fire. And the real reason the bloodline had weakened was that no one had thought to try something different, too caught up in upholding the reputation of ancestors long past. So, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 works her magic. Whatever little she thinks she has, prays for a miracle, and receives one in her tears. She weeps while she tends to him, tears falling onto him, and the fever breaks. The wound heals. Her son keeps his life. The only thing left of this fever a scar on his shoulder, and neither of them the wiser that it was 𝐬𝐻𝐻 all along. Izuku never catches fever again, and whatever other colds or ills he catches leaves so quickly it's like he never had them at all. Katsuki isn't quite the same after that. It doesn't help that their parents had more or less banned them from seeing each other for the time being, but there was only so much they could do to avoid each other before inevitably meeting again. They're still in the same class, for one, and once Izuku goes back to school, all anyone can ever talk about how he was sick and nearly died. Nobody knows it was at Katsuki's hands, however well-meaning he may have been, but Katsuki knows, and he can't stand it. Izuku doesn't see him for a week, maybe two, but when he does, upon finally returning to school, he's like a completely different person. He makes no attempt to interact except to brush off or push away, and acts so coldly towards him that the other children catch on. They make no attempt to stop him, or even to say anything about it, in the way that children often do when one of their higher-ranking peers enacts an unexpected power dynamic. They join in, lest they incur the wrath of someone who has already mastered their gifts fully and can very easily enforce this should they choose not to. But Izuku wasn't particularly well liked anyway, Katsuki aside, and it's an easy switch to make. Now that the boy wolf no longer tolerates him, they no longer have to pretend. Changelings were mistakes, after all, thieves undeserving of the bodies they stole, and the gifts they would have received rescinded instead with their inherent unworthiness, and one should take every opportunity to remind them of that. It's strange, though, because Katsuki keeps on pushing him away. And yet he still stalks around his house, the next full moon that comes, and the one after that, and the one after that. He and his mother can hear him, and know that it's him from his howls and his mother's howls. Izuku isn't quite sure if he means to protect him or hunt him, and the creatures slaughtered in the night left on the back porch dangerous ones that could easily creep into his home and snatch him away leave no strong evidence for either argument. Katsuki makes no more appearances in Izuku's room, only on the streets around them, revealed only by the briefest of sparks flickering through the night, and the howls of him and his mother. One night, not quite autumn just yet, but when the summer has grown cool, and Katsuki's howls have begun to deepen enough to rattle the house, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 closes his window, which had been open all this time for the boy wolf to climb in, and locks it. Izuku doesn't open it again. It stays closed for quite some time. So, Izuku grows up, friendless and seemingly giftless, into a scrawny boy of 14. His freckles have remained just that, and the scar on his shoulder is barely noticeable, silvery and moon-pale on already fair skin. He's grown somewhat warped, as changelings often do, and has had his friendliness traded for anxiousness, his kindness now a vehicle for appeasement and survival, rather than out of any genuine want to do good for another human being. The desire is there, sure, but reduced to nearly dust, pushed to the back, while self-preservation keeps a steely grip on him at very nearly all times. With no one to talk to, he becomes accustomed to talking to himself, and with being resolutely ignored, he becomes accustomed to talking to himself at any and all times of day. It didn't particularly matter, because he wasn't listened to anyway, and by the time that he was, the habit had stuck. Attempting to self-soothe his isolation became a means of ridicule, continuing until he shut his mouth altogether. The cycle repeats and turns back in on itself. and our bureaus of humiliation and self-destruction, only growing worse with each cycle, until he has grown twisted and anxious and quiet, speaking only when spoken to, and speaking only words of pacification. Katsuki, in growing into himself, has only grown worse. He masters his gifts far beyond any of the other children in their class are capable of, and far faster, merely 14, just the same as Izuku, but already carries himself with more power and confidence than most other wolves twice his age. He knows it, their classmates know it, their teachers know it. Practically everyone knows it, heaping praise upon him at so much of a mention of it. And perhaps Katsuki has grown a bit warped from this, too. Confidence turned to arrogance, to entitlement. Disputing this ignites a violent anger in the boy. And any number of things could be considered this. Paranoia running wild as his stability crumbles under the weight of his pride. He has natural talent, certainly, and no one is disputing that. But Katsuki is the best because he makes it so, and puts far more effort into maintaining his place of privilege than anyone could possibly know. Izuku is the living reminder of his one great failure, and it has made him crueler as time went on. What was once just a cold sort of neglect steadily built up to an active antagonizing. And while he won't go as far as certain classmates, he certainly doesn't shy away from it. But it's not all bad, he thinks. Katsuki isn't bad all the time. He still does his patrols around the neighborhood when the full moon is out. Even though Izuku and his mother moved, and their home had to be found again by the Bakugos, and he still stops the other kids from going too far, sometimes. And sometimes, he walks home with him, too, though it might be at a distance. And he's still got his mother, who may not have a witch son, but still makes things that he can use, wards and purifying salts and the like, and the notebooks he's taken to writing in, because he may not have a gift, but he can still study and learn from the gifts of others. He can still enjoy his childhood hobby, even if the one he shared it with no longer deems to call him friend. And he still has his childhood hero, of course. It wasn't every day that one had the privilege of meeting, in Izuku's opinion, the greatest guardian the world has ever known. Unfortunately, it took on a bit of a sour tinge to it, both because the few words he'd exchanged with his idol, and that this came at the price of being attacked and nearly eaten. These things aside, it hadn't really been that great a day to start with in the first place. They were getting back their aptitude tests today, and one of his classmates, for some reason, thought it would be appropriate to mention the school that Izuku wanted to go to, because hey, didn't Bakugo want to go there, too? It seemed so small, so innocuous a thing. But Izuku had been gripped with dread the moment they had begun to speak. Because he knew that once his choice was revealed, it would be yet another thing he would be humiliated with. Stupid boy, idiot boy, thinking he could get into the top-rated school for guardians. How delusional could he be? It was no place for a giftless wretch such as himself, and everyone knew it. In particular, he was intensely afraid of one person's reaction, because he knew without a single doubt that he would be furious, and that there was nothing that he could do to appease him. Katsuki would take this as an insult, unable to escape his own failure, and whirl around on him and terrorize him, while their teacher did nothing to stop him. Maybe the teacher thought scaring him would be good for him, would finally convince him to give up his ill-fated dream. Maybe the teacher didn't care, or couldn't be bothered. Izuku honestly doesn't know which it is. But his classmate brings it up, inevitably and predictably. There's laughter at his expense and the usual jeering. And Katsuki does indeed take this as an insult, Izuku's heart hammering away in his chest, while he dreads what sort of punishment the wolf will dole out for this perceived slight. He never hurts him physically or badly, but he doesn't really have to. He torments him with sneers, regularly puts him in his place with words alone. And he does these things this time, yes. But Izuku had known this would happen, not that this softened any blows. But this time, he takes these things further, takes the notebook Izuku had been pressing his nose into, keeping his head down and desperately trying not to attract attention, even as it was already upon him, rips it right out from under him, and scorches it. Chucks it out the window. tells him that there was no nope of him ever fulfilling this dream, and worse. Useless changeling, worthless. Better to be dead than to try to emulate the child that was meant to be there in their place. And Izuku just takes it. Takes all the muck they throw at him. Swallows it down. Lets it fester between his lungs, filling him from the bottom of his stomach up to his heart, choking on it. His jaw clenches, his eyes sting, fearful and angry. But he continues to stare at his desk, keeping his face carefully blank. He says not a word for the rest of the time that he's in school, and lets no tears fall until he's walking back home. He finds the notebook it had landed in the pond off to the side of the school, but only partially. It was still usable and his notes still intact, so he takes it, scorched or not, and hides it in his bag where his mom won't see it. He can't let her see it. He takes a back way home, perhaps slightly longer than his usual route, but not as populated, allowing him to make his way home alone, while tears trickled numbly down his cheeks and try and come up with excuses as to why his notebook is ruined before his mom inevitably sees it. Perhaps this inattention is why he became prey to the creature roaming around underground. He doesn't notice it at first, head in a fog, while the manhole cover behind him unscrews itself and pushes itself aside, the grinding metal just white noise. He doesn't notice the slime seeping out of the newly opened hole, clinging to shadows as it trailed after him until the entire length of its viscous body emerged from the sewer. He doesn't notice anything, in fact, until the exact second that it coils a tendril around his ankle, and by then, it's too late. He has barely a moment to acknowledge its presence before it shoots up his back, wrapping him up within itself and pressing in from all sides. Lungs constricted, he cannot call out for help, can't even breathe, and it knows this, laughing at him. "Don't worry, kid, it'll be over soon enough," it chuckles into his ear. A strange sort of tingle starts creeping across his skin, growing steadily warmer until it finally burns, and he thrashes in its hold, to no avail. The creature, however, does seem to notice this, or something else about him, because it slides all too easily from smugness to a strange sort of ravenous awe. It breathes, he thinks. There's something like an inhale-exhale, its liquid body flowing with bubbles around his constricted limbs, and it doesn't go slack with its grip, but its entire demeanor changes. "Oh," it breathes, open-mouthed with reverent hunger. Drool slips between its teeth onto his head and Izuku shudders. "Oh, you're different, aren't you?" And it says different, like it's found a prize, like it's found something to covet and gloat over. And Izuku finds himself so constricted that he cannot move even the slightest bit. His vision starts fading, peering into black. But before he can slip and fall right over that precarious edge, he is torn from the creature's grip. All at once, his body feels too hot, too cold in the open air. Winds whipping around him frigid on the acid burns, but the rest of his body overheating now that the slime's chilled body didn't envelop it. The slime dissipates, but he knows better than to think it gone permanently. The winds that ripped it away from him slow and gently set him on his feet, and he may stumble, but there is someone to catch him. He's held upright by large, firm hands, and it takes him several seconds blinking blearily up at his rescuer to realize that it's 𝐬𝐬 himself, with his eyes hidden in shadow and his great, mirthful grin. Izuku doesn't quite believe what he's seeing at first, but it's all there. His lion-headed hood is pulled back, but it's there, and so is his red cloak, and the pale gold fur lining it. And the longer he looks, the more he cannot deny what he sees. He shrieks a little bit, admittedly, once enough oxygen has filled his lungs again to facilitate this. 𝐬𝐬 takes it in stride, chuckling. He manages to thank him, somehow, in between the frantic word vomit of questions and praises and rambling, and 𝐬𝐬 merely nods, dusts him off, and, after making sure he is truly unharmed, bids him farewell. But Izuku doesn't know if he'll ever get this opportunity again, and he can't just let him leave. He has so many questions. What if he never sees him again? Izuku grabs onto his cloak, desperation giving him a strength far beyond his capability, and he pulls it square off his shoulders. Then, he watches in horror, yelling, as 𝐻𝐸 shrinks and shrivels before his eyes. He's roughly the same height, realistically, but he looks severely emaciated, body shrunk down to nearly skin and bone. 2 blue pinpricks now appear in the darkness where his eyes should be, bright and fiery, and his yellow hair grows wild. 𝐻𝐸, for the most part, takes it in stride, as he seems to do in response to everything, merely sighing. "Keep it down, kid," he tells him a little gruffly. It's a huge difference from the 𝐻𝐸 before, boisterous perhaps, but friendly and cheerful. This one just seems tired, even if it is actually 𝐻𝐸. Real or not, Izuku sputters and apologizes, and just about launches into another apologetic, rambling mess, when 𝐻𝐸 interrupts him with, "It's not your fault, kid. I've been like this a long time." The cloak makes an illusion so people don't worry. The would-be 𝐻𝐸 eyes him up and down. "Not just anybody can just pull it right off me. Though what kind of gift you got, kid?" he asks, still gruff, but good-natured, this time, cracking a gaunt grin. Izuku swallows, bracing himself for rejection. "I don't have any gifts," Izuku says weakly, eyes drifting down to his shoes. 𝐻𝐸 says. "Damn shame. You would have made a fine witch, I bet." Izuku nods. "My mom's a witch," he adds, not sure why. 𝐻𝐸 hums again, thoughtful. "Sometimes that's just how it works out," he says, giving Izuku a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Don't tell anyone about this, all right? If people found out, they'd lose their minds." Izuku nods. They certainly would. He's not sure anyone would believe him, anyway. "What happened to you?" he asks, mumbling it. 𝐻𝐸 sighs. "A couple years ago, I got in a fight with this powerful magician, and he really did a number on me," he explains, lifting up his shirt. His torso is absolutely skeletal, but what is more concerning is the horrifyingly large scar taking up most of it, centered on the side of his ribs and blooming out from there. "What did he do to you?" Izuku asks, gaping. 𝐻𝐸 blinks at him, and merely gestures at the scar again, as if that explains everything. It sort of does, in a way. "Our encounter really messed me up. I beat him but barely. I can hardly cast anymore, at least not like I used to." At Izuku's horrified face, he explains, "I can still use my magic. I just need to limit it so I don't hurt myself." And then, the cloak helps. It was made with the illusion woven into it, so it's not a strain on me, and I can use more magic longer. Izuku nods along. A moment passes. "Mr. 𝐻𝐸," he starts, unable to stop himself. He goes through his words slowly, trying to make sure each one is coherent, and that he doesn't just start mumbling and muttering like he usually does. "I don't have any gifts, but I really, really want to be a guardian when I grow up, just like you. I want to help people and protect them, and give them no reason to fear anything as long as I'm there. Do you think it's possible for someone like me?" 𝐻𝐸 goes silent for a moment, giving him a hard look. Izuku, already still braced for rejection, can feel it coming before he says anything, his eyes watering. "No," 𝐻𝐸 tells him, voice gentle but firm. "There's too many people out there with powerful gifts that'll use them to their advantage. And some monsters just can't be taken down without them. You'd just be endangering yourself and everyone around you if you did." "Oh," Izuku says after a moment, quiet. "I guess that makes sense. There's plenty of other professions that you can do without any gifts that will still let you help people, though," 𝐻𝐸 adds. "You could be a policeman or a detective." Izuku nods numbly, willing his tears not to spill. 𝐻𝐸 coughs into his elbow awkwardly, and Izuku thinks he sees something red briefly. "Anyway, I've got to get going," he says. "Have to track down that slime monster before it reforms and gets too far away. Be careful walking home. Stay safe, stick to the main roads." He pulls his cloak back up, ties it, and the illusion is back in place by the time Izuku blinks. Izuku blinks again, and with a gust of wind, he's gone. When he gets home, his mom sees the scorched notebook and the acid burns, The tear tracks on her son's face and patches him up and fusses over him, but doesn't press when her son doesn't tell her what happened and why and who. She's upset and angry, but he appreciates her attempting to give him space on the matter instead of pestering him. He thinks she's going to call the school and complain anyway. This wouldn't be the first time that he's come home like this, only usually it was because of his classmates instead. And like she's done for him before, she makes his favorite dinner and they watch his favorite shows together until it's time to do his homework and go to bed. Of course, he never actually gets to finish his homework because the day isn't over yet. And there is, as it turns out, always plenty of time for far more awful things to happen. It's around 9 or so, and he's a good chunk of the way into his homework when he begins to hear a scuffle outside his bedroom window. This isn't too unusual by itself. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 still made it a point of patrolling the neighborhood on full moons and leaving scraps of his conquests on the balcony of the Midoriya's tiny apartment. His mom tolerates it for the most part, if only because it's where she obtains the majority of her reagents for her spell work. However, what's unusual about this is that it's not a full moon, it's not anywhere near it. So there should be no reason whatsoever for 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 to be roaming around outside his apartment building right now, making a racket. And 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 is just tired, at this point, far too tired to put forth the energy to even care, let alone be afraid or angry. So, when he opens his window to yell at 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 to go home and leave him alone, he is not expecting to see him without his wolf skin, or to see him struggling with the same slime creature that had him in its clutches earlier. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 goes a little numb with disbelief for a few horrible seconds, it taking far too long to process that 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 is without his wolf skin, without his flames, and, for some reason, can't seem to get either going. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 can see sparks flare briefly in the night air, but they flicker and fade before catching anything, leaving the boy wolf without his fire mane. Then, without thinking, adrenaline streaking through his body, 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 scrambles into the kitchen, scrabbling through cabinets until he finds his mother's purifying salts, taking the whole jar and bolting out the front door before his mother can stop him. He can hear her, distantly, saying, 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭, what's going on? Worry evident in her strained voice, but he can't stop himself. He knows things are weird and bad between him and 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭. He knows he's not stupid, but he doesn't want him to be hurt. He doesn't want him to die. So he sprints out the building, unable to stop himself, and dumps damn near the whole jar on the creature. The slime shrieks, a wretched, unearthly sound, and recoils away from 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭, who gasps and sputters now that it's not wrapped around his neck. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭's leg is bent at a wrong angle, and it hurts to look at, more jarring than the burns coiled around his limbs and the ooze dribbling from his mouth. But more jarring still is that the slime, still dissolving, flesh bubbling and hissing, starts dragging itself towards 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 instead, with relentless, single-minded obsession. It slithers towards him with a seemingly impossible speed, groaning, and 𝐬𝐡𝐚 finds himself wrapped up in it again, even as it disintegrates. It burns his skin immediately, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 shrieking, and all the while, the creature babbles incoherently, reverently, as it coils around him, around his throat, and attempts to slide down his open mouth. It only partly succeeds, and it doesn't last long, fortunately. They're given that small mercy at least. Yagi appears again, eyes flaring sharply in the dark, and only made more intimidating with his hood up. He seems to burst fully formed from the dark, slicing through the air to them, and he thrusts his fist into the remnants of the creature, everything going still for an eerie half-second before the sheer force rippling from his hand eviscerates it from 𝐬𝐡𝐚's body. "I'm sorry," he says, remorseful. "It kept getting away from me. I should have been here sooner." He coughs, and unmistakably, there is blood dripping from the side of his mouth when he pulls his hand away. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 in that moment realizes the gravity of his injuries and the state of his body, hidden away in his lion-hearted cloak. "Don't," 𝐬𝐡𝐚 coughs. "Don't hurt yourself. Please." Yagi gives him a weird look. "Kid," he starts. "I'm a guardian." It's my job to protect you, no matter what. There is still blood dripping down his chin as he says this, and he wipes it away hastily. But Izuku saw it, and Yagi knows it. They're not left alone for long. 𝐴𝐻 had contacted the police within moments of Yagi arriving, the encounter going so quickly she could not step in or intervene. They arrive shortly, and so does Katsuki's mother, 𝐴𝐻 contacting her too. Katsuki is loaded into the back of an ambulance and taken to the 𝐴𝐻. After being questioned by the police, Izuku is gently manhandled into Mitsuki's car, and he, his mother, and Katsuki's mother rush off to the 𝐴𝐻 too, 𝐴𝐻 and Mitsuki insisting that he be looked at too, while she checks on her son. He can't really call it an awkward silence in the car, because there's far too much going on around them for it to really qualify as silence. Mitsuki is right on the ambulance's tail lights, siren, and all. So, while none of them speak, it's certainly not quiet. But eventually, this theoretical silence is broken as well. Mitsuki unable to let things lay where they were. "Izu-kun," she starts, and he almost doesn't hear her at first from the back seat. "Thanks for watching out for Katsuki. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in to help him. He'd probably be dead," no one says, but the words hang above them anyway. It's okay," he says, stumbling a little bit. What does he call her now? When he was much younger, he'd call her auntie, but he hasn't spoken to her in something like 10 years. Calling her Bakugo seems too formal, though, and he can't bring himself to do it. "It's okay, auntie," he decides. He doesn't say, "I know he'd do the same for me," because he doesn't know. Not really anymore. Mitsuki hums, satisfied for now, and they pull into the hospital parking lot. Mitsuki sits with them in the waiting room while they get Katsuki set up, and things are feeling pretty surreal right now for Izuku. Less than an hour ago, he was just trying to finish his homework, and now he's sitting in a hospital waiting room in the middle of the night, while the mother of his childhood friend, now tormentor, exchanges comforts with his own mother. The three of them waiting for Izuku to be called up to be examined. He doesn't have to wait too long, but he's still there long enough for a nurse to come over to them and talk to Mitsuki about their current procedure. After examining him, they've determined that they need to drain the fluid pooling in Katsuki's lungs from the slime creature, and that they need to set his broken leg before they can begin to heal it. They've already cleaned and bandaged the acid burns the best they can, but right now the focus is on those two main things, and they don't want to use magic at all before they're completely sure that any remnants of the creature have been cleared out. The chance of it regenerating from the littlest bit of ooze left over in his body was small, but still there, and better safe than sorry. Izuku doesn't hear much more of that, because he's then called back himself, walking there on his own 2 feet. They examine him in what he can only assume are the same ways they did Katsuki. They check to see if there's any breaks, check to see if there's any fluids, and check up on his burns. They find no breaks or fluids, and patch up his burns well enough. But it was extremely unusual for there to be no trace of anything at all in his lungs, even if his interaction with the creature was incredibly brief. They elect to keep him overnight just to be cautious, and he can only assume that it's for the hospital staff's convenience that he ends up in the same room as Katsuki. More accurately, Katsuki ends up in the same room as him. Izuku arrives first, and has plenty of time to get comfortable and sit with his mom before Katsuki is wheeled in. He hadn't really achieved any semblance of normalcy, not really, but seeing Katsuki sacked out in a hospital bed with an oxygen mask is something truly eerie. He's not sure if the spike of anxiety at his presence is merely habitual, or if it's because he's never seen him this grievously injured or vulnerable. He seems to be running with both, at the moment, on edge and cautious, but unable to keep himself from fretting over his injuries. It only takes him a few moments to compose himself into something outwardly stable, just the same. Mitsuki follows close behind the nurses as they wheel the bed in next to Izuku's and set him up to be in here, standing carefully out of the way while another nurse quietly explains to her what they're doing and what they did, and what they're going to do now. The plan is, currently, to let him heal using his own regeneration instead of using magic to speed it up. The risk of the creature being restored is still too much for the doctors to want to risk using magic, and being that he's a wolf, he already has a radically better rate of regeneration than most other creatures. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 has to stay overnight, too, obviously. Izuku knew this distantly, but he'd still been dreading it all the same. It's actually not so bad. His mom and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's getting to know each other again, and making amends. They talk easily, trading stories of their sons, as if they'd been friends this entire time, rather than politely ignoring each other the last 10 or so years. At some point, Mitsuki manages to get a hold of her husband and work out planned shifts for them to keep their son company in the 𝐴𝐼r. Mitsuki leaves him in 𝐴𝐻𝐬's hands, just for now, while she goes to trade places with her husband, promising that he'll bring snacks and games for their boys, because 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 is going to wake up fully eventually, and has been drifting in and out already, and that 𝐴𝐻𝐬 doesn't have to stay with them if she doesn't want to. She's sure that she has work in the morning, too. But 𝐴𝐻𝐬 doesn't mind, and was already planning on staying with her son however long he was here anyway. This is pleasing to Mitsuki, somehow, that 𝐴𝐻𝐬 would do this, beyond the cursory appreciation of one mother looking out for another. She goes warm with open affection for the last few minutes that she's there before leaving, practically radiating it. And Izuku wonders when they'd been accepted back into her pack again. Wonders what 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's reaction will be when he learns of this. In the hour or so they have between Mitsuki leaving and Masaru arriving, they receive another visitor. 𝐴𝐻𝐬 tries to talk to Izuku about what happened, but it's stilted on both their parts, and they don't quite make much headway between their collective hesitance to confront the issue at hand and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 sleeping in the bed next to him. His mother knows that things have been weird between him and the boy wolf, but didn't know the extent of it. This event tearing whatever they had between them wide open. Not much is said at all before their visitor arrives. A nurse gently knocking on the doorframe to let them know they were there, and to ask whether or not this visitor was allowed. It's Yagi, of course, because obviously Izuku would spend his entire life wanting to meet him only to see him 3 times in one day, and be thoroughly exhausted with the concept by then. No doubt that the hospital had made an exception to their late visiting hours because it was Yagi himself who came to call. But they let him in, figuring he had more questions for the police, or perhaps even just wanted to check in with him. Though Izuku knows that's a misguided hope on his part. "Sorry to disturb you at such a late hour," he says quietly to his mother. "But I had something important I wanted to discuss with the both of you." Ah, so it is about the attack, Izuku thinks, pushing down the irrational sense of disappointment. "What is it?" his mother asks, still so weary from the night's proceedings thus far. "Miss Midoriya, I presume?" he asks. She nods. "Pleased to make your acquaintance. Though I suppose the setting isn't much better than it was before," he says, cracking a grin. 𝐴𝐻𝐬 and her son regard him tiredly, his attempt to break the ice falling flat. He seems to realize this, sighing. "Miss Midoriya," he says lowly, moving on. "With your permission, I would like to take your son on as an apprentice." 𝐴𝐻𝐬 blinks owlishly at him, and Izuku just stares. That's about all he can manage to do, in fact, and he stares for so long that it makes Yagi visibly uncomfortable. "If you're up for it, he amends. "I won't make you do it if you don't want to." "Why do you want to make him your apprentice?" 𝐴𝐻𝐬 asks. She's quiet, still, both from exhaustion and being unwilling to wake 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬. "Because your son has shown the sort of courage it takes to be a guardian, and the willingness to act and do whatever it takes to protect people," Yagi tells her genuinely. "I believe that if given the proper guidance, he can become one of the greatest the world's ever seen." Izuku is crying before he even finishes the sentence, big, fat tears rolling down his face, while he shakes and shudders and tries to keep it as quiet as he possibly can. "And," Yagi continues, "because I believe that your son has the same gift that I do." "What?" Izuku croaks, snuffling. Yagi turns to Izuku. "Young man, are you familiar with a creature called a beacon?" he asks. Izuku blinks at him, still sniffling, and 𝐀𝐦 stiffens in her seat. No, he replies. What's that? Mr. Yagi, you don't think? 𝐀𝐦 starts, trailing off before she can finish her sentence. But it's been so long. Surely if he was, it would have manifested by now, she continues, bargaining. Yagi nods. I do, he confirms. And I believe that it's just gone unnoticed. What's a beacon? Izuku says, louder this time. They're creatures that don't seem to have any gifts of their own, when in reality, they have one of the most treasured gifts of all, he explains. Which is the ability to receive gifts from others and use the powers they've been given. Exasperated disbelief and a manic, irrational sort of hope war within Izuku, jostling for control. The first wins out, for now, though the latter is not too far behind. That doesn't make any sense. It can't be real, he says, brow furrowing. I've never heard of a gift like that. I mean, I know of creatures that can copy or borrow abilities, but it's never permanent, and rarely as strong. Izuku begins to ramble. He probably shouldn't be, but he can't help himself, regressing into mumbling and murmuring until Yagi interrupts him with a quiet but assertive. Let me ask you something, young Midoriya. When you encountered the slime the first time, he starts carefully. Was there anything about it that seemed strange or out of place? Was there anything about it you couldn't explain? Izuku thinks for a moment, brow furrowing. The creature's near reverence for him comes back in a flash, and his brow only furrows deeper. Yeah, he replies, far away. It seemed happy that it had me, like, far beyond just being pleased that it had caught something to eat. And the second time? Yagi prompts, clearing leading him up to something. Izuku's brow furrows deeper still. It just dropped everything to come after me, Izuku says, partly to them and partly to himself, even though it was clearly dying. Yagi nods at him once. It was drawn to you, young Midoriya, he explains. Beacons have this sort of uncanny charm about them that attracts all sorts of attention, for better or for worse. They tend to be rare not only because of their low birth rate, but also because those with that gift are very likely to get spirited away before too long. Izuku thinks about his classmates and Katsuki, and their unwavering focus on him, however negative it was. For better or worse, indeed. Yagi eyes something on him, on his shoulder, maybe, and Izuku feels the irrational urge to cover up, hospital gown or not. 𝐀𝐦 takes notice of this, and uncharacteristically bristles up in defense. May I ask you something else, young man? He asks. Izuku nods guardedly in reply. Yagi points at him. How did you get that scar on your shoulder? Izuku can't keep eye contact at this, staring down at his folded hands in his lap. It's from a wolf, isn't it? He asks, confirming. Mr. Yagi, this is incredibly inappropriate, 𝐀𝐦 scolds, not the final straw, but close. No, Mom, Izuku soothes. It's okay. I don't mind. 𝐀𝐦 looks like she has several conflicting feelings about that, but cannot bring herself to say anything in reply. He turns back to Yagi. Yeah, it's from a wolf, he tells him, gaze returning to his folded hands before long. Yagi doesn't ask, but he certainly assumes, glancing at Katsuki in the other bed for a moment. What happened, exactly, when you received this scar? He asks. I was 4, Izuku begins to explain, feeling very, very small. We were friends, and he wanted to turn me, since I don't have any gifts, and it didn't work. It was too much for me to handle. If it wasn't for my mom taking care of me, I probably would have died. He trails off, unsure of what exactly Yagi is looking for. Yagi himself looks a little guilty for asking. I apologize for any discomfort I have caused you, Yagi says earnestly. But I need to ask you just a few more questions. Are you all right with that, young Midoriya? Izuku rubs at his eyes, nodding. Miss Midoriya? 𝐀𝐦 is doing her best to be angry, but it's hard for her, worry bubbling and boiling and threatening to overwhelm it. But there is little she wouldn't do for her son, so she tries. Only a few more, she allows. 𝐀𝐦. Thank you, 𝐬𝐬 says, bowing his head. Now, then. How did it feel when you were bitten, young 𝐷𝗉𝗄? He asks, searching. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 squints at him, but he asserts, please. It's important. 𝐬𝐻𝐸, truthfully, had not thought about that for a long time. It wasn't the sort of thing he typically thought about, and he didn't really have any sort of motivation to do so, given the circumstances. Recalling it now, he doesn't remember much, but there were still a few things that stood out about it. It felt like, he tries. It felt like I was burning alive, like there was a fire lit in me that couldn't be put out. And when your mother took care of you? 𝐬𝐬 asks. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 thinks. Like I was laying out in the rain, he says vaguely. I don't really remember all that much. I'm sorry. It's all right, young 𝐷𝗉𝗄, 𝐬𝐬 assures. You don't need to apologize for anything. Now, Miss 𝐷𝗉𝗄, he continues, switching his attention. Do you remember what you did when you took care of him? Family remedies, mostly, she says carefully. I hadn't done spell work like that in a while, so I wasn't sure if it would actually work, she admits, anxious. I was so worried about him, I ended up crying a lot of the time. He's probably remembering that, if anything. 𝐬𝐬 hums agreeably, thinking. Do you know why the bite didn't work? He asks. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 frowns, still sore. Yeah, because I'm a changeling, he replies sourly. I'm not supposed to be anything. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 stares in shock at this admission, at a loss for words. Young man, if you really didn't have any gifts, then the bite would have worked, 𝐬𝐬 explains, not at all appreciating 𝐬𝐻𝐸's self-depreciation. And if you had any other gifts, then nothing would have changed anyway. But something did change. You didn't become a wolf because you're already something else, but something did change. The bite became a gift, because it was in your ability to receive it as one, even if you weren't quite ready yet. And your mother's tears, this, too, became a gift, even if it was just your mother wishing for your survival. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 blinks at him, his eyes nearly bugging out of his head. Young 𝐷𝗉𝗄, you have a gift unlike any other, because you are a creature unlike any other. They're exceptionally rare, and have gone by many names over the years, 𝐬𝐕𝐺𝐻, 𝐬𝐵𝐺𝐻, beacons, panacea, but they're real. It's what I am, he explains, gesturing to himself. He keeps his voice low, but it is undeniable how important this is to him, blue flames returning to his shadowed eyes. It's what you are. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 blinks fresh tears out of his eyes, trembling. This is all he's ever wanted to hear. You matter. You're something. You're not nothing. And it very nearly overwhelms him to hear them spoken for the first time in years. It's difficult to keep quiet, but he tries, covering his mouth with cupped hands while sobs racked his body, relief washing over him like a flood. His mother's voice is so soft he almost doesn't hear it, at first. I can't allow this, 𝐴𝐻𝐸 tells them. She's hesitant, apologetic, but she still tells them this, just the same. It's like ice in his veins, and he jerks around to face her. She flounders, put on the spot. Listen, I'm sorry 𝐬𝐻𝐸, but I can't allow this, she explains hastily. It's too dangerous. Look at how hurt you were just from today. You would be putting yourself in that kind of danger every single day, and I can't let that happen. She swallows, becoming overwhelmed herself. Her eyes have gone pink and glossy, tears threatening to spill any minute. Mom, please, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 begs. I can't just put you in harm's way like that, 𝐬𝐻𝐸. If something happened to you, I could never forgive myself. He would be under my protection, Miss 𝐷𝗉𝗄, 𝐬𝐬 says, attempting to reason with her. I would be there every step of the way. Mr. 𝐬𝐬, I'm sure you mean well, but, she starts, strained. I don't know you. I've only just met you, and you can't expect me to be all right with handing off my son to a stranger. How am I supposed to trust that you'll keep him from getting hurt? Mom, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 starts again, pleading. Please. I want this more than anything. This is my dream. He interrupts himself with a sniff as he attempts to swallow down his sobs. All I want to do is help people. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 𝐖𝐡𝐚 attempts to chasten, but her voice is too hoarse, her eyes too watery, and 𝐬𝐡𝐚 cannot, will not be stopped. You see, can't keep me from this, he says through his tears, fiercely, desperately. I know what I am now. Even if you say no to this, I'll find some other way to help people. I'm going to be a guardian. I'm going to do something. He sniffs loudly again, shaking. He can't see his mother's expression, vision blurring. Mom, I have a gift, and this could be my only chance to understand it. Please, just let me do this, he begs. 𝐸𝐴 looks at her son, any argument she could come up with feeling feeble and useless on her tongue in the wake of his declaration. After a moment, Yagi speaks again. I'm not going to take your son away from you, Miss Midoriya, he tells her gently. You're going to be there for every part of it, too. I'll make sure of it. 𝐸𝐴's eyes flick between them, weary but considering. She steels herself. If you can promise me that you can keep my son safe, and that you'll keep me involved, she begins to say, laying out her conditions as resolutely as she's able. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 goes a little numb again as his heart does its damnedest to break free of his rib cage, choking with feverish hope. Then I will give you permission to take my son as your apprentice. Yagi breaks into a rakish grin, his confidence returning. I will do my best, Miss Midoriya, he assures her, and 𝐬𝐡𝐚 breaks down into hysterics all over again. Yagi doesn't stay too much longer after that, already taking up too much of their time as it is when 𝐬𝐡𝐚 should be resting. He bids them farewell, and promises to arrange something more concrete when 𝐬𝐡𝐚 is well enough to. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 passes out pretty quickly after he leaves, exhausted from the whole day, only stirring again when Masaru arrives. He blinks up blearily at him, awoken by the noise, only to be gently shushed as Masaru pulls up 𝐬𝐡𝐚's covers and ruffles his hair. He puts a blanket on 𝐸𝐴 as well, asleep in the chair next to 𝐬𝐡𝐚's bed, and sets up a chair between the two beds. He thinks he can hear some kind of whining, like a scared dog, and it takes him a minute to realize it's Katsuki, still strung out on pain meds, but awake, at least. He reaches out for his father, who gently shushes him, too, carting his fingers through his hair until Katsuki calms again. Masaru sits in the chair he put between them, retrieving a book from the bag he carried in with him, and begins to read. There is a noticeable rise in temperature, the fire demon radiating warmth from the entirety of his being, and the last thing 𝐬𝐡𝐚 remembers before falling asleep again is looking at the curled horns growing from Masaru's forehead and the demon's eyes, smoldering like coals. It's the safest he's felt in a long time. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 gets sent home the following morning. The hospital staff are still at a loss as to how he could have avoided getting any fluids in his lungs when the creature was hell-bent on forcing itself down his throat. But objectively, there's nothing there they can find. Ergo, there's nothing further they can do other than send him home. So send him home they do. Katsuki gets sent home on crutches at the end of that week. They can't find anything substantial left, but given the nature of slimes and their truly ridiculous ability to regenerate themselves, it was still better to play safe than sorry. So, they rely on his body's heightened healing abilities, run tests to check on him for a few days, and leave him with the instruction to immediately contact them if anything changed for the worst. For the rest of the week, it's quiet at school, and it was apparently a serious enough event that his classmates actually leave him alone for the most part. School is the most peaceful it's been for 𝐬𝐡𝐚 in years. Now, this is all well and good at first, but this unfortunately comes with consequences 𝐬𝐡𝐚 did not expect. Katsuki being in the hospital for several days in a row meant that someone needed to bring him the work that he missed in school, and also, with him being on crutches, someone to walk him to and from school, as well as helping him around while he was there. And with their parents having rekindled their friendship, it had made all the sense in the world for Mitsuki to ask 𝐸𝐴 that 𝐬𝐡𝐚 be the one to do it, and 𝐸𝐴, of course, to accept it. His mother didn't really know how much Katsuki had been involved with his harassment at school. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 didn't name names, And there were plenty of other kids around with some kind of fire ability. And besides that, it was still exceptionally rare for him to go home with an injury much worse than the usual bumps or bruises. So he can't really blame her, really, when he's gone to all this trouble to keep his suffering to himself and his tormentor's names unknown. But it still irrationally feels like a betrayal. For all she knows, he and 𝐻𝐸 could have kept their word and kept their distance all these years, rather than the wolf taking part, sometimes even instigating. Bringing him his work in the hospital, that isn't so bad. One of his parents was always present when Izuku delivered it, and 𝐻𝐸 was too worn out to talk too much. Anyway, there'd nearly been an incident when Mitsuki had asked Izuku to stay a bit one day, because 𝐻𝐸 was having trouble with some of the work they were going through, and it would be easier for Izuku, who was also learning it, to tell him what they did in class, rather than Mitsuki try and recall something that hadn't been vital information in a few decades. 𝐻𝐸 had ground out, "I don't need help," voice still a little hoarse from his sore throat. And though Mitsuki had brushed him aside, uncaring of his pride, she still accepted the copy Izuku had made of his notes, and didn't give him any fuss when he hurried off. "I'm getting tutored," he'd said, and it wasn't a lie, technically. It just hadn't started yet. Yogi had yet to contact him again just yet. But it's only been a few days, so he's not worried just yet. "That's great, Izu-kun," Mitsuki praises. "Maybe you can help 𝐻𝐸 catch up on his work when he comes back to school." She chuckled a little, either unaware or uncaring of the look her son was giving her and Izuku. No, things don't start to get bad again until 𝐻𝐸 returns to school the following Sunday. The worst of it at the end of that week. Each day is more stressful than the last. Mitsuki drives them to school each morning, to make it a little easier for her son to get around without straining his leg too much. And each afternoon, when they're let out, he and 𝐻𝐸 wait for her to come back and pick them up. This, perhaps, is an inaccurate description. Mornings mostly involve the most awkward silence he's ever had the misfortune of experiencing, while they're in the car, while Mitsuki hums and sings along to the radio, or idly chats with them. Both he and 𝐻𝐸 sit in the back seat, so that Izuku could help him if he needed it, and pointedly don't look at each other while 𝐻𝐸 seethes quietly at this prospect. Then, when she had dropped them off and was out of immediate sight, 𝐻𝐸 would hobble away from Izuku as quickly as he could, even while Izuku carried both of their things. Izuku imagines it's so the boy wolf isn't seen with the likes of him, at least not voluntarily, and truthfully, this is probably for the best. Izuku can't imagine the sort of treatment he'd get for this if his other classmates saw either of them in such close proximity. Well, he can, actually, but he doesn't want to. Afternoons, they wait for 𝐻𝐸's mother to come get them, but at a distance, pretending they're each waiting for separate rides, so as not give off any hint of association. This works out for the first few days, being that they're consistently the last two there in their class. The others long since headed home by the time Mitsuki's car pulls up. Going by her schedule means that they get to school earlier than their peers and leave later. But it seems, unfortunately, this can't last forever. Saturday morning sees them dropped off at their usual time, and with 𝐻𝐸's usual morning cheer, which is to say, none at all. But unlike the other mornings where they would trudge to their homeroom, more or less by themselves, this time, one of 𝐻𝐸's acquaintances arrives about the same time they do. Which means he got to see the full procession of Izuku climbing out of the car, helping 𝐻𝐸 clamber out, then going to grab their respective things while 𝐻𝐸 stood by and pretended to wait for him before heading in. Now, Izuku means acquaintance rather than friend, because he's not too sure if 𝐻𝐸 was actually fond enough of him Tsubasa, that is to call him friend. Izuku isn't really sure 𝐻𝐸 was that fond of anybody. Izuku doesn't like Tsubasa that much, or at all, really. It's difficult to like one of his prime antagonists after all, 𝐻𝐸 and their strange history aside. Tsubasa never liked him at all, not even when they were younger. So seeing him upon getting out of the car immediately puts him on edge, even more so when 𝐻𝐸 sees him, too. Izuku can see his hackles raising, and knows immediately that he's going to be blamed for this, somehow, especially when Tsubasa for some reason decides to wander over and say good morning to them. His good morning is less that, and more of this. Bakugo, what are you doing, hanging out with Deku? He laughs as he asks this, like he's playing. But Izuku knows better than to think that. This only makes his anxiety skyrocket. Worse still, is that the driver's side window is still open, and that Katsuki's mother heard all this. He doesn't think Tsubasa realized this at first, or else he wouldn't have said it. At least not in such an obvious tone, and certainly not within earshot. What did he call him? She asks. She's not pleased, but there's no dangerous edge to her voice. Not yet, at least. She doesn't really need it, with how everyone freezes the instant those words leave her mouth. She sounds more concerned than anything else, confused, perhaps. There are lots of words for what Izuku is perceived to be a changeling, a fey child, and this is yet one more. This one is a bit more recently developed. Language evolving the way it always does when certain words are restricted. And one's antagonists must develop new ones that won't be as easily recognized to anyone but their target. Katsuki, what did he just call him? She asks again. And there it is, building up on the fringes as her tone becomes humorless. Katsuki is still frozen in place, deer in headlights, and Izuku honestly hadn't expected this to be his nightmare scenario. But there he was, just the same. The worst part yet was that despite himself, he couldn't just leave well enough alone. It's a nickname, he blurts out, frantic. Mitsuki raises an eyebrow at him, and he scrambles to finish. It's just a nickname. The whole class calls me that. She looks at him, then glances over to her son and his friend, gaze piercing. Neither of them have said a single word since this began, and they don't appear as if they're going to be able to without some prompting. Is this true? She asks, leveling them with a measuring stare. Yeah, Katsuki manages to bite out, Tsubasa nodding rapidly beside him. She doesn't appear to believe them, and makes no attempt to hide this. But still, she replies, if you say so, Katsuki. Izuku hurries to get Katsuki's things from the car, trying to end this as soon as possible. She bids them goodbye, the three of them still shaken. Izuku from the punishment yet to come and the other two from having nearly faced the consequences of their actions. Tsubasa bids them goodbye as well before hurrying in, citing the original reason he'd been early in the first place. Meeting with their homeroom teacher about the aptitude test, or their class from yesterday, or something of that nature. Izuku doesn't hear him, and can't really bring himself to care. There's more important things for him to be worrying about, such as Katsuki, and the slow turn of his head as he looks to Izuku, rage burning in his red eyes. I don't need your fucking help, Deku, he snarls. Now normally, Izuku would be freezing up, or stuttering anxiously, or doing everything in his power to appease Katsuki, or otherwise seek some way to clear up this mess. But there's just something about this entire scenario that grates on him in just the exact wrong way, that Izuku Midoriya, for the first time in his life, is furious. Are you serious right now? He asks, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. Little bullets fired haphazardly at Katsuki. This anger is new and strange, but it would be for someone who was never allowed to express it before. He's anxious, still, even more so now that he's angry, regretting every word he says as soon as he says it, but it by no means stopping him, just the same. The two emotions roil and clash just as much as they feed off each other, and he finds his whole body thrumming with the volatile energy this creates. Katsuki blinks at him, shock at his rebuttal quickly turning to rage, but he doesn't get so much as a word out before Izuku continues, his own anger overwhelming. I have been carrying your bag for you, and helping you in and out of the car, and in and out of class all this week, and that's what you have to say to me. His words are going faster, now, rushing out lest he lose the will to say them. He's sick to his stomach, something black and molten dropping into the pit of it and boiling over. His eyes are already watering, and he hates himself for it. Deku, Katsuki growls, a warning. No, Izuku hisses, spitting it out like it leaves a vile taste in his mouth. No, you don't get to treat me like this, 𝐻𝐻𝐿. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 seems to recoil at the nickname. And though 𝐬𝐿 does, too, old hurts welling up with it. He can't help but think, good. Taking that one moment of pettiness for himself. All I've done is try and help you. And you still think you're better than me. You couldn't. He pauses, attempting to force himself to stop fucking stuttering for 1 fucking second before continuing. He swallows. You couldn't even beat that slime monster by yourself. I did. I saved you. And you don't even see me as an actual person. He gasps before he can help it, hiccups, and tears stream down his cheeks. Why? He demands. The old hurts are in full force now, welling up out of him just as easily as his tears do. I know our parents told us we couldn't be friends anymore, but you don't have to treat me like this. You didn't have to abandon me. What did I do to you that made you like this? Why do you hate me so much? And 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 has nothing to say to him. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭, for once, is speechless. 𝐬𝐿 trembles and sniffs, trying to stifle down his cries before it attracts any more attention than it already has. And when 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 doesn't say anything for the next few seconds, frozen in time, 𝐬𝐿 stomps past him, both of their bags in hand. He throws their bags in their seats and bolts for the bathroom, holing up in the stall at the far end. He sobs, loud and messy behind the hands trying to muffle it, anger evaporating the second he's by himself. He can't breathe, and oh God, no, what has he done? He manages to work his way through his panic attack before class starts and make his way back to homeroom. It's something he's already used to, unfortunately, cleaning himself up before anyone can see it. He's too late for this one, though, and he knows it. So he's still numb with fear when he goes back, fearing the worst from his outburst. It's still a little early, but not by much, so the class has filled up quite a bit by the time he gets back. He takes his seat behind 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭, who won't look at him. And 𝐬𝐿 doesn't know if this is better or worse, just that it's different enough to send another spike of panic through him. But 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 doesn't do anything, or say anything, the rest of the day, at least not to him. So 𝐬𝐿 calms somewhat. He calms enough to keep up a stable front, anyway. It helps that the other kids haven't started up there harassing him again just yet, though he knows that's inevitable, whether or not Tsubasa saw them that morning, as the clock ticks closer and closer to the final bell. However, he finds himself dreading being alone with 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 again. He can't do this again. Not right now. So, when it rings, and they're gathering up their things to leave, 𝐬𝐿 tells 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 something about having to meet with his tutor. He doesn't remember what exactly, just that he had mumbled it at him before rushing out of the building. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 doesn't stop him, but he didn't exactly give him time to, either. 𝐬𝐿 walks home by himself. He takes the back roads there, despite knowing better, and does his best to stay out of sight. He tries not to think about anything in particular, especially not Yagi having yet to even contact him since the hospital. But his mind seems hell-bent on dredging up anything it can to upset him again. He thinks about that morning. He thinks about 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 and their classmates and their school. He thinks about how stupid he is, thinking that Yagi would even look twice at him, that he even had a sliver of a chance to get into UA. He thinks about how it'd be better if the slime had just eaten him. Hell, it'd be better if he'd never even been born. Then at least his dad wouldn't have left, and he wouldn't be a burden on his mom. He puts himself back together long before he arrives home, taking care to get there the same time that he has been since Mitsuki started driving him to school. He takes care to sculpt himself into something resembling a human shape. But he's a little too tired for 𝐀𝐦 to not notice something's wrong. When she asks, he doesn't tell her, tries to brush it off the best he can. But she digs her heels in, like she always does on his bad days. She pushes him onto the couch, pushes a blanket onto him, and puts food in front of him and stares at him until he eats it. She holes up with him for the weekend. They watch some movies together. She helps him with his homework, and is generally relentless with her affection, until he's well enough that he can crawl out of that dark place again. He really doesn't deserve her. Come Monday morning, He's still not ready to face 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 again. But he doesn't really have much of a choice, and tries to shore up what little determination he can to push through it. This is only temporary, after all. The cast is going to have to come off eventually. So, he tries to put on a brave face when Mitsuki comes to pick him up that morning. Katsuki is just as subdued as he was on Saturday, which immediately puts Izuku on edge, but not much more than that. He doesn't really have the energy for it right now. Mitsuki, however, is as chipper as she always is, and bids Izuku good morning as he climbs into the back seat next to Katsuki, who glances at him for maybe a second before looking away. Izuku says good morning to nobody in particular, just shy of mumbling it under his breath. "I wish you'd told me about having to see your tutor the other day. I could have driven you there so you didn't have to walk," Mitsuki laments. Izuku blinks. He glances at Katsuki, who still won't look at him, but had apparently covered for him at some point. "You don't have to do that," he assures. "It was kind of last minute anyway. I didn't have time to tell you before I had to leave." Katsuki makes no move to call him out on this, which makes Izuku a little nervous. It was incredibly obvious that he was lying, and honestly he was a little concerned as to how easily it came to him. "No, I insist," Mitsuki, insists. "It's really no big deal. Just let me know next time, okay?" "Okay," he mumbles, looking out the window. After insisting on exchanging numbers with Izuku, Mitsuki drops them off and bids them goodbye. Katsuki is still very much subdued the entire process of this, being uncharacteristically cooperative even after she leaves. There's grumbles here and there, but it's nothing like how it had been during the build-up to his fit a few days ago. It still makes Izuku nervous, understandably so, but he honestly could not get to the same level of anxiety he'd had earlier. He's too tired, too accepting of it right now. The day passes by without incident, continuing even to Mitsuki picking them up again and helping Katsuki back into the car, wherein he's still quiet and oddly well behaved. This continues the next day, and the day after, and keeps going for almost the full week, only being interrupted once before resuming. The interruption starts off rather typical in nature. His classmates as a whole have apparently decided that enough time has passed since he'd nearly been killed and eaten where they can resume their day-to-day harassment of him. Or rather, they think they can do this, falling easily back into their usual patterns of talking about him within earshot, laughing at him, etc. But they don't quite get to the etc. part. Apparently, at some point between having a near-death experience and listening to their classmates jeering, Katsuki had decided that this was no longer allowed. "Don't you fucking idiots have anything better to do?" he'd snapped, without so much as looking up from his work. Some of us are actually trying to get some fucking work done. Now, while this wasn't entirely unusual, it was true, yes, that they'd occasionally get too rowdy in their picking on him, and Katsuki would snap and snarl about them being too loud. Hypocritical as it was, what made it odd was his continuing to cut them off if they'd made so much as a peep after that. And that, despite what was seemingly his usual personality returning, he still hadn't picked up where he'd left off with Izuku, and still remained quiet and subdued with him. The peak of this was probably when Izuku had begun muttering and mumbling in his usual way, and instead of Katsuki responding his usual way, threats, yelling, the works, he merely turned around and knocked on the corner of Izuku's desk. He opened his mouth once, attempting to say something. Katsuki hadn't called him by anything, and hasn't called him anything since Izuku screamed at him, he noticed. Katsuki seemed to be avoiding using any kind of name at all. But the knock was enough to get Izuku's attention, and he jumped a little in his seat. "You're mumbling," Katsuki said, finally. He wasn't particularly kind about it, but he wasn't mean either, which was extremely unusual, to say the least. "Oh," Izuku replied simply. "Sorry, I'll stop." Katsuki grunts in reply, and it sounds suspiciously like sake. Izuku is becoming more and more convinced that he did in fact die, and is now stuck in some kind of twilight realm, because this strange, not courtesy Katsuki started showing him only keeps going from there. to the point where he started saying good morning to him, too. Or at least, the grumbling coming from his mouth approximates to about that. That started around week 3, and hasn't stopped since. Izuku suspects it has something to do with the way that Mitsuki stares at her son, meaningfully until he grunts, good morning, at him. Much in the same way that she stares at them until they put their seatbelts on. The look on her face very plainly reads, I know you have to do this, and you know you have to do this, and we are not moving from this spot until you do. He also deeply suspects that this was born of a conversation he wasn't privy to, because they seem to have entire exchanges without him, but about him, and using only their eyes as a means of communication. It would be fascinating if it didn't make him incredibly nervous. In time, however, this gives way to the complacency of routine, and by the time week 4 rolls around, Izuku is no longer nervous at all, at least not in regards to getting driven to school by Katsuki and his mother. School, he can't really say the same, but it's much better than it used to be. Katsuki has made it a point of shutting down their classmates consistently, all with perfectly reasonable excuses. Mind, but the fact of the matter is, he's still doing it, and he wasn't before. At least, he wasn't doing it nearly as much. Then, week 5 rolls around, and Katsuki gets his cast off. Naturally, Mitsuki's driving them to and from school comes to an end, as does Izuku's helping Katsuki move around. Izuku isn't sure what to expect from this, honestly. This entire process had been a series of surprises from beginning to end, both good and bad. He supposed that things would return to normal now, and now that Katsuki wasn't chained to him involuntarily, he would resume ignoring him. The thought of that genuinely saddens Izuku, which is a bit of a shock considering, well, everything. He knew it was a bit far-fetched to think that they would just go right back to the way they were when they were children. But he'd hoped they wouldn't go back to being strangers, at least. He misses the camaraderie they once had more than he thought he did, and far more than he'd like to admit. But wishing for it didn't make it any more likely. The morning after Katsuki gets his cast off, Izuku forgets that he did, because he wakes up at the same time he'd been waking up for the past month. It's earlier than what should be his usual time, but he's so used to it that he still hurries around the apartment in the early hours of the morning, getting ready for an arrival that would not be there. He doesn't remember, in fact, until his mother emerges the shower and gently reminds him that Mrs. Bakugo isn't going to be driving him anymore. The initial disbelief and consequent, sudden remembrance sort of sets the tone for the rest of the day. It's going to be a long one, he's sure. He still sets off earlier than what should be his usual time, too. He was too fidgety, warning bells going off in his head that he would be late if he didn't leave right now, immediately. The route he takes when he walks is the same that Katsuki takes. It makes sense, they live in the same area, after all, but he's not sure what will happen when he sees him. He does see him, eventually. It's inevitable that their paths will cross, it's just a matter of when. Today, it happens to be around the halfway mark. Izuku is being guided forward by muscle memory alone, daydreaming to avoid thinking about it for right now. He pauses at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to turn, when out of the corner of his eye, he sees Katsuki walk up to it and linger in his periphery. Despite himself, Izuku glances over to him and receives a grumbled "G morning" for his trouble. Izuku returns the favor in kind, bidding Katsuki a good morning partway through a yawn. The light turns, and they walk across the street. They don't talk, but Katsuki easily falls into step with him. Normally, he takes much longer strides, his longer legs and added height over Izuku giving him that advantage. But he seems content to just keep pace today. Izuku doesn't think they're friends again just yet, but they're certainly not strangers anymore. This is okay for now, he thinks. On the Saturday after Katsuki gets his cast off, maybe 2 or 3 days after, Izuku comes home to Yagi sitting at his kitchen table. It's a little eerie, coming home from school, Katsuki walking with him most of the way now, before splitting off into his own neighborhood, and seeing a red cloak hanging from the coat hooks in the front hallway that's just shy of familiar. It's too alien an object to fit in this intimate environment, so Izuku doesn't recognize it at first, before it hits him all at once and disbelief propels him into the kitchen. But there 𝐻𝐻𝐬 sits, a towering skeleton of a man with hands too large to be wrapped around one of his mother's teacups, yet doing so nonetheless. 𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐬 sits across from him, pouring her own tea, and 𝐻𝐻𝐬 grins at Izuku as he stumbles in. "Ah, young Midoriya, you're just in time," he says, his voice far larger than his body would suggest. It rolls out of him like thunder, and the impact of it feels about the same, too. "I've only just gotten here, myself," he continues, softer now, his voice matching with something muted and deeper. His enthusiasm is no less than before, though, and it still stuns Izuku long enough that he can explain himself before the boy damn near explodes with the questions he has for him, such as "Where the hell have you been this whole time?" "Sorry it took so long to get back to you," 𝐻𝐻𝐬 tells him sheepishly. "I had a few things to take care of before I could get settled, and they turned out to be a lot more complicated than I had originally anticipated. But it's all taken care of now, so there's nothing else keeping me from teaching you the ways of our kind." Izuku is rendered speechless again at these words, though this time more out of joy and relief than shock. He feels like he's giving himself whiplash. 𝐻𝐻𝐬, as it turns out, had been speaking to his mother about the matter of his schooling, more specifically, the school he planned on going to after he graduated from this one. One of the things he'd been taking care of had been doing all the necessary paperwork to begin teaching at UA, as well as moving closer to the campus and the Midoriya residence. There was also the matter of doing all the necessary paperwork to register him as his apprentice. But that involved 𝐻𝐻𝐬 more than it did Izuku, hence him arriving prior to Izuku and speaking to her first. They also had been in the process of working out a schedule of when 𝐻𝐻𝐬 could come and teach Izuku within the safety of the apartment, at least for now. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 had assured 𝐻𝐻𝐬 that she would present every step of the way, and he was a man of his word. He had planned on keeping Izuku close to home for the most part, even when they would eventually start branching out, partly because he didn't want to announce that he was teaching there until the school year actually started, but also because he wanted to keep Izuku's identity a secret until he was safely in UA. "It's not till next year, and I don't want to endanger young Midoriya any more than I have to. If the media found out about this, it'd be an absolute shit show," 𝐻𝐻𝐬 explains. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 raises an eyebrow at him, and he coughs. "Pardon my language," he says hoarsely. He had a couple ideas to execute this, mostly centered around making Izuku a cloak similar to his own, but with slightly differing enchantments more suited to their needs. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 agrees, volunteers to make it herself, and suggests making a mask to go with it as well. She wanted to have multiple lines of defense, just in case one of them failed or was compromised somehow. It was the simplest of things for Izuku to pluck 𝐻𝐻𝐬's cloak from his shoulders, after all. A mask would be a little bit more difficult. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 is quick to point out, however, that it was something of a feat that Izuku was able to do that in the first place. Not just anybody could do it, and the fact that he could spoke a lot of his potential. The next hour or so is spent talking about what Izuku had already learned in regards to magic, and figuring out where to go from there. Gift lest she might have thought her son, but not witless, and so 𝐻𝐻𝐬 was careful to teach her son all that she could about witches and their craft, whenever she could. On that note, Izuku did learn a fair amount about magic himself, having researched it whenever he came upon a new guardian or hunter, and began to consume all the information about them he could find. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 is actually a bit impressed by his many notebooks, much to Izuku's mortification. It was one thing to gush about the heroes you look up to other people of like minds, and another one entirely for them to find the culmination of your obsessive hunger for knowledge of them, specifically, personally. Izuku sort of wants to slip the surly bonds of this earth when 𝐻𝐻𝐬 begins flipping through pages and chuckling to himself. That's certainly what it feels like he's doing right now, and it certainly isn't helping with the persistent thought that he's actually dead, and this is some kind of twilight realm. The evening inevitably comes to an end, and 𝐻𝐻𝐬 has to leave for the night. They've finished more or less what he's set out to accomplish organization, mostly, and figuring out where exactly to start. So after exchanging numbers with both 𝐀𝐻𝐦 and 𝐍𝐴, he sets off for the night. 𝐍𝐴 is terribly disappointed for 𝐬𝐡 to have to leave so soon. But rationally he knows that the man has his own life and a job. Possibly one of the most, if not the most important job in the country. It just feels too good to be true. Like if he doesn't hold on tight, it'll slip right out between his fingers. But 𝐬𝐡 shows up at their decided time that Sunday, and every other day that week, and each time it feels a little less unsure and a little bit more real until 𝐍𝐴 can reasonably say that 𝐬𝐡 is completely serious about this and won't up and leave them all of a sudden for no reason at all. It's strange, knowing that he can rely on someone for once, his mother notwithstanding, of course. 𝐀𝐦 is a saint whose kindness no one deserved. The first Sunday that they meet up, it's at a rundown beach at the edge of town. It's what would have been a bright and cheery morning, if not for the mountains of garbage as far as the eye could see. The first thing you need to know about being a guardian, 𝐬𝐡 begins to explain, far too jovial for how early it is in the morning, is that first and foremost, it is about community. As a guardian, your role is to protect it, but also to improve and better it in any way you can, no matter how small that may be. It seems that nowadays, many guardians have forgotten this, and are more worried about their own political standing than anything else. But the truth of the matter is they'd be pointless without something to protect. So, young 𝐬𝐿, your first lesson is this: take care of your community, and they'll take care of you. 𝐍𝐴 nods, listening in rapt attention. With that in mind, I'd like to draw your attention to where we are. 𝐬𝐡 gestures around them with large hands. The cloak is safely tucked away in a backpack 𝐀𝐻𝐦 currently carries. He didn't need it to be able to use his magic, and he wasn't really looking to be recognized in a public place, but he liked to have it close by, just in case. Because of the ocean currents and the way this beach is situated, it's very easy for trash to be washed ashore here. Eventually, it just built up so much that people stopped trying to clean it up and just about abandoned it. Now anyone only ever comes around when they want to dump more of their trash. So, here's where we come in. Every Sunday, we're going to come here, and we're going to work on clearing away this section of the beach until it's completely clean. Obviously, this isn't going to happen overnight, but I am going to set goals for you for what I want you to get done in a day. And we are not going to leave until they're done, or until the dump truck gets here. We can take however long as you need, but keep in mind that truck usually shows up around sundown. 𝐍𝐴 nods, swallowing a little nervously. It's going to be hard, 𝐬𝐡 admits, almost apologetically. Are you sure you're up for it? 𝐍𝐴 nods again, more vigorously this time. 𝐬𝐡 grins at him. That's the spirit. The goals that 𝐬𝐡 sets for 𝐍𝐴 are challenging, but fair. At the end of this first session, 𝐍𝐴 meets it. But barely, the truck showing up right as he's carrying the last few bits of trash up the beach. He had worked at a pretty steady pace most of the day, stopping only for lunch. His mother had packed them a picnic, laying out a blanket, and their food once 𝐍𝐴 had cleared enough space. She spent most of the day talking with 𝐬𝐡 while 𝐍𝐴 worked, and encouraging him when 𝐬𝐡 did. Monday, 𝐍𝐴 rests and 𝐬𝐡 works. But Tuesday the man returns, and the day is spent teaching him about beacons and what it means to be one. 𝐍𝐴 learns that yes, while it was true that he was born without any gifts, this did not mean that he didn't develop his own magic later. He did, it just went unnoticed, as 𝐬𝐡 had said. It was actually remarkably common for beacons to not form their first gift, their uncanny charm, as 𝐬𝐡 calls it, until they were a little older, as children. Sometimes it was so subtle, it would go on for years and years without being noticed. A lot of the time, people don't even realize they have this gift, they just chalk it up to their own charisma, not even knowing that their own magic has been passively aiding them the entire time. 𝐬𝐡 explains, chipper. He seems to be excited to be able to talk about this. 𝐍𝐴 doesn't imagine he'd have many people to chat about it with. How does it work exactly? 𝐍𝐴 asks, barely holding back his hunger for this knowledge. Izuku had known next to nothing about these creatures, about what he is, and the multiple internet searches he'd done while waiting for Yagi's return had gleaned very little information. It mostly amounted to hearsay, folklore, and a lot of contradicting opinions. Yagi hums, thoughtful. Usually, it's pretty instinctual, he starts. It'll activate without you realizing it. Like if you're hurt or scared, it'll encourage the people around you into leaving you be, or taking care of you instead. Izuku stares at him, putting pieces together. How? He asks simply. Well, put bluntly, it just makes you feel nice to be around, Yagi explains. You put out a presence around yourself, and anyone caught in that field is attracted to you somehow, whether they like it or not. It's hard to notice, a lot of the time, but sometimes the reaction it evokes is so strong that it's impossible to miss sometimes, to the point of working against its intended purpose, like with what happened with the slime. Izuku stares at his hands for a moment. That would certainly explain some things. It definitely explains why his classmates were particularly relentless in their harassing him. He'd been practically rewarding them for it without even realizing it. Or that they'd just been particularly cruel. But this probably didn't help matters much. So today, Yagi says, finally leading into what he'd been aiming for since the start of this session. I'm going to teach you how to tap into this yourself. It's the most basic of your abilities, but the most important. I've used it to calm civilians, to talk down would-be assailants, and most importantly, stop conflict before it can start. Having abilities to help you in combat is important, of course, but the best thing you can do in a fight is stop it from happening at all. It takes Yagi an alarmingly short amount of time to teach Izuku how to turn on this ability, partly because, as it turns out, Izuku had been doing this entire life without realizing it anyway. Turning it off is a different matter, however, and takes Izuku several hours to learn. This may have been in part because activating it felt a little too close to the lead-up of an anxiety attack, skin buzzing with nervous energy, and Izuku accidentally tipped over that edge into one. It's horrible, like it usually is, but had the added bonus of having his childhood hero present to witness this as well as his mother. Needless to say, it was a thoroughly humiliating experience all around. The rest of the session, after Izuku was pulled out of the horrid brain fog, is spent instead teaching Izuku the importance of being able to identify creatures and gifts at a glance. Izuku, thankfully, is able to recover some dignity in already being incredibly knowledgeable in this area. Whatever dignity there was to be found in his being wrapped up in a blanket and having tea shoved into his hands by his mother, anyway. Despite Izuku's insistence that he could continue, Yagi cuts the session short, worried for his apprentice. He goes to take off early as well, but 𝐀𝐦 manages to talk him into staying for dinner, which mostly consists of making him a plate and putting it in front of him before he can say no. Yagi doesn't put up too much of a fuss, regardless, and ruffles Izuku's hair when he says goodbye that day. The next day, Izuku makes it a point of making sure that this particular gift is locked up tight, and miraculously makes it through the whole day without being so much as glanced at. He's pleased, at first, until he does the thing he typically does wherein he ruins it for himself by thinking about it too hard. You see, it occurs to him there is the possibility that, in addition to making himself basically irresistible to be picked on, he could also have somehow used this latent power to trick people into liking him. People like his mom, or Yagi, or Mr. and Mrs. Bakugo. He could have manipulated Katsuki into liking him when they were kids, or again now that they've grown some. He excuses himself to the bathroom during lunch, where it's come to a head in the form it usually does his tears. He picks the one farthest from the cafeteria to hole up in, so as not to be discovered, and hides in the stall farthest from the door, so that even if someone did come in, he'd have time to quiet himself. This goes according to plan the way it usually does, too, until it doesn't, and the door creaks open. He quiets himself accordingly. He'd been working through it himself, trying to force these thoughts down so he could actually function when lunch was over and get back to class. Breathing through it, and taking solace in the silence and privacy of an enclosed space. He waits for them to do their business and leave, but they don't. Instead, there's a hesitant step forward and an uneasy quiet until Izuku hears the words, "You in here?" It's Katsuki, because of course it is, though hearing him hesitant and unsure is an alien concept. Izuku shuts right up, clapping a hand over his mouth to quiet his breathing. Rationally, he knows that this isn't going to work. Katsuki is a wolf and can probably smell him even if he can't see or hear him. But he just wants to be left alone. Please, he just wants everyone to leave him be. After a moment or two, Katsuki leaves, huffing and grumbling and stomping out the door, leaving Izuku in his hiding place and well enough alone. There's a familiar buzz under his skin, and Izuku hates himself a little bit. Katsuki doesn't say anything to him about it when he goes back to class, and Izuku spends the rest of the day being benignly ignored by his class as a whole. It's one of the kinder things they could have done to him. He takes a back way home, avoiding Katsuki again, and likes to think he's made himself into something resembling a functional human being by the time he gets back home. But it becomes readily apparent to both his mom and Yagi that he isn't. "Something troubling you, my boy?" Yagi asks, the picture of concern. And Izuku supposes that there isn't really any way around this, is there? "Can my gift force people to like me?" he asks, feeling very, very small. Yagi raises an eyebrow at him, frowning. "Can I use it to make someone do something that they don't want to do?" "No," Yagi tells him firmly. "Ultimately, you cannot force anyone to do something that they don't want to do. This gift merely encourages other possibilities, and is easy to resist if you are sure in what you want. You cannot make someone like you with this gift alone. It can smooth things out for a good first impression, but it's up to them to decide if they like you or not. So Izuku continues, swallowing. "I didn't trick you into doing this." Yagi's frown deepens. "No," he tells him again, resolute. "You did not. You couldn't have." Izuku sags forward, sighing in relief. "Did something happen today at school, honey?" 𝐀𝐦 asks softly. Izuku rubs at his face reflexively, scrubbing away tears that aren't there. "No, nothing happened," he replies easily. "I just thought about something too hard." Yagi looks like he wants to say something, brow furrowing, but holds his tongue. The topic isn't brought up again. They move on to that day's lesson, the basics of witchcraft. His mother leads today, considering whatever he has, he would have gotten from her. She doesn't bother with runes or wards, not when she'd been teaching him those his whole life, but instead focuses on the reagents she uses, or more accurately, where she gets them. "I know that the Bakugos give us a lot to work with just from their hunts, but I used to grow a lot of it, back at the old house," 𝐀𝐦 says. She's surprisingly tranquil at the mention of the house his father owned. They'd lived in it a little while longer after he left them, but couldn't afford to stay there, moving to their current apartment. The wolves found them again shortly after, leaving the scraps of their conquests on the Midoriya's tiny balcony next to 𝐀𝐦's potted plants, the only garden she has to her name. "I was thinking we could get you started on growing your own, too," she suggests, fond and proud. "It's better to use stuff you grow or make yourself. Anyway, it's stronger in your own hands than anyone else's, usually." With that in mind, they begin planning out Izuku's half of the garden. What seeds to plant, what ingredients he would need, what they have and what they could use, and the like. They have very limited space to work with, and so must limit what he can grow. It's just as well, 𝐀𝐦 supposes, better to start small so that he can learn as he goes. She already has a few ideas of where to start, and they head off to the market to buy the supplies they need. Yagi insists on paying for everything. He's the one ultimately responsible for Izuku in this venture, after all, so it's only right that he pays for it. He also insists on taking them out to dinner. It's too late for 𝐀𝐦 to get started on cooking anything, he says, and she should take a break from it anyway, since she headed the lesson tonight. 𝐀𝐦 is flustered, unused to being doted on in such fashion in a long while. But still 𝐻𝐻𝐸 insists, saying that it's only fair he do his part in some way or another. Thursday, 𝐻𝐻𝐸 works again. But that's just fine, and 𝐀𝐦 keeps her son busy with planting and telling him stories about her family and their recipes and secrets passed down. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 scribbles down as much as he can, this being the first time he's heard of a lot of this. His father shamed her out of this, he thinks, or his actions shamed her out of this. And 𝐬𝐻𝐸 finds a quiet anger for his father simmering in his stomach, uncovered for the first time in ages. It's good that he left, he finds himself thinking. He didn't deserve his mother, anyway. He hates him, he decides. 𝐀𝐦, seemingly from nowhere, appears in the front hallway with a thick, golden strand of small, but heavy, metal bells. She places the loop on the doorknob. It's to keep away evil spirits, she says. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 writes this down, too. Friday and Saturday are used to teach 𝐬𝐻𝐸 about the same thing, and go approximately the same way. Which is to say, 𝐻𝐻𝐸 attempts to talk to 𝐬𝐻𝐸 about the gift he'd received from 𝐘𝐻𝐸 when they were children, attempts to help 𝐬𝐻𝐸 unlock this power, and is shocked to see the amount of strength bursting from it just from a cursory glance. Unsurprisingly, it is still incredibly overwhelming, and 𝐬𝐻𝐸 is unable to tap into it without being engulfed in fire and fever once more. Saturday evening, after putting this fire under lock and key, 𝐻𝐻𝐸 decides to put a pin in this one for now and move on, but does encourage 𝐬𝐻𝐸 to try and speak to the wolf that gave him this gift, to see how they handle it. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 just short of tells him that this is just not possible, but 𝐻𝐻𝐸 encourages him to try, just the same. Sunday finds them at the beach again, cleaning up what they can, and they don't talk about the silvery pale scar marring 𝐬𝐻𝐸's flesh. This continues for weeks. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 falls easily into the schedule 𝐻𝐻𝐸 and his mother have set for him. The structure is comforting and makes his time at school much, much easier. It gives him something to look forward to when he goes home, and that's not something he could say for a long time. Though, school is going much easier than it used to, as well. And he's glad for that, too. He's more or less got the hang of keeping the uncanny charm put away, and can go through his days unbothered, mostly. That isn't to say that there aren't still incidents, because there are. There's just not as much, and they're not as bad, to say the least. It helps that 𝐘𝐻𝐸 is still doing his self-appointed job of playing guard dog when the time calls for it. And typically he doesn't have to do much more than snap and snarl for a minute to make their classmates back off. Of course, there comes a time when 𝐘𝐻𝐸 tires of this, too. Not playing guard dog, no. He tires of their classmates starting anything with 𝐬𝐻𝐸 at all. Period. The end. It's been just about a month since 𝐬𝐻𝐸's lessons have started, well into May and the warm weather that follows. It's about midway through the morning, and they're working amongst themselves while their teacher grades their assignments. It doesn't take too long for things to come to a head. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had been making something of a spectacle of himself, having long since finished his class assignment and moved on to other things being focusing on his budding garden. He'd gotten the first couple plants to sprout, sure, but there had to be some way to better utilize the space he'd been given to use so that he could have more. He'd been so focused on this that he hadn't noticed that his mouth had been running a dialogue without him. And with 𝐘𝐻𝐸 caring less and less about it as of late, he simply hadn't realized he was doing it until another classmate had told him to shut up. What good do you think that's going to do? Yet another sneered, laughing when 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had startled and sputtered out apologies. You can't make yourself learn witchcraft if you don't already have the gift for it, idiot. That's not how it works. You can't make yourself be something you're not. You're always going to be giftless, and there's nothing you can do about it, stupid Deku. Now 𝐬𝐻𝐸, at this point, is doing his best not to respond, and trying to keep himself calm so that he didn't accidentally trigger the presence that made him so easy to pick on to begin with. And he's doing a good job so far, he thinks. But 𝐘𝐻𝐸 has a different opinion on the situation entirely. Don't fucking call him that, he says. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 almost doesn't hear it, because it's quieter than 𝐘𝐻𝐸 normally is, and the rest of the class is still chattering away, not knowing and not caring. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 hasn't really done much in the past couple weeks to make their classmates like him. They tolerate him, of course. But this is mostly because on any given day, 𝐬𝐡𝐭 could destroy them utterly without hardly trying. So with him defending Izuku, as well as being unusually calm and subdued, at least in comparison to how he'd been the last several years, their classmates seem to think that he's lost his edge and can be challenged. They are woefully incorrect. "You got a problem, Bakugo," the first one says, the one who told Izuku to shut up in the first place. "I said," 𝐬𝐡𝐭 starts, turning in his seat to level them with a glare. "Don't fucking call him that." His voice drops in pitch a bit as he says this, each word reverberating with an eerie growl. He hasn't done this in a good while, and it's enough to give their classmates pause, and for a few more of them around them to go silent. Izuku had learned, in his obsessive hunt for knowledge about guardians and hunters, and what gifts they possess, that certain wolves could take their intimidation to the next level, and make their prey fear them just by presence alone, much in the same way Izuku's charms. 𝐬𝐡𝐭's fury rolls off of him, the pressure of it crushing, and Izuku is in no way surprised that he could do this, too. It only takes another moment before the entire class is silent and still. "If I catch any of shitheads calling him that one more time, I'll fucking kill you," he growls, and means it. He bares his teeth, fangs that Izuku has seen stained with the blood of vermin he's crushed between them, and knows in his heart that 𝐬𝐡𝐭 means it. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 stares down their classmates until they go back to their work, and chances a glance at Izuku. The boy blinks at him, flabbergasted, and 𝐬𝐡𝐭 doesn't seem to be satisfied by this, but turns back to his work anyway. Izuku has no idea what just happened. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 comes and sits with him at lunch that day, though it's less that and more of him stomping right up to where Izuku was sitting and slamming his tray on the table. It startles Izuku, and it upsets his food very slightly, a few crumbs scattering with the impact. Luckily, the notepad he had been scribbling in hadn't been caught in the crossfire. "I don't hate you," 𝐬𝐡𝐭 bites out, savagely. Izuku blinks at him. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 won't look at him, nostrils flaring, breathing deeply like he's already trying to calm himself down. It looks a little ridiculous, to be honest. "Okay," Izuku replies hesitantly. It's been a while since the boy wolf had acted like his old self, so Izuku's not too worried. But 𝐬𝐡𝐭 looks unhinged and nervous, and it's making Izuku nervous. "I don't hate you, either." "You fucking should," 𝐬𝐡𝐭 snaps, words coming out in a rush. "You have every right to. You didn't do anything wrong, and I was fucking awful to you, all the time, for no reason. You should absolutely hate me." 𝐬𝐡𝐭 is breathing heavily by the end, eyes looking suspiciously watery under his furrowed brow. Izuku looks at him, and thinks for a moment. "Is this about this morning?" he asks, quietly. "Or this is about everything else?" "Yes," 𝐬𝐡𝐭 spits. "Both. Whatever." There's an awkward pause, clearly struggling with the next few words. "Listen, you don't have to be my fucking friend again or anything like that. But I wanted you to know, I'm sorry. For everything." Izuku would say he's surprised, and he is, to be fair, but not as much as he thought he'd be. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 had been circling him for a while now, hemming and hawing and dragging his feet. But about what, Izuku could never figure out. The real surprise is that 𝐬𝐡𝐭 actually went through with it. More than anything, Izuku is tired. He's tired of being alone and getting hurt. He's tired of being treated as something less than a human being. He's tired of all of this. But 𝐬𝐡𝐭 is trying. He's obviously trying. Whether or not he would keep up with this is still questionable. But he's trying hard to be better, to be nicer. And he's made leaps and bounds in the relatively short time that he's been doing it. Izuku wants to give him that chance. He's hurt, he's angry. But at the end of the day, he still wants to be friends. He never wanted to stop being friends in the first place. "I accept your apology," Izuku tells him, keeping his voice even. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 squints at him, confused, and Izuku says, "I'm still hurt." I'm going to be hurt about this for a very long time. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for any of that. Yeah, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 agrees, grimacing. I figured. But I still want to be friends, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 tells him. Did you want to be friends again, 𝐾𝐻𝐭? Yes. Yeah, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 replies, a little dumbstruck. Yeah. It's another month or so before Yagi asks about the scar again. He's been wanting to for a while, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 thinks, gaze resting on the boy's shoulder a breath too long every once in a while. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 isn't really sure what to tell him. He's been making great strides with 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬, yes, but he's relatively certain that the subject of the scar, and the bite which nearly killed him, is still very awkward to bring up. He can't exactly ask, hey, what were you thinking about when you were 5 years old, and you tried to turn me and ended up almost killing me instead? Just wondering. Young 𝐬𝐡𝐤, he says, we need to figure out what we're going to do about your wolf gift. The first name basis is still something of a shock, Yagi giving him a mild heart attack each time he says it. It doesn't help that Yagi says this in the tone of a patient but long-suffering father, and that he's been becoming more openly affectionate as time went on. He fusses over 𝐬𝐡𝐤 almost as much as 𝐀𝐻 does, and 𝐬𝐡𝐤 soaks up the attention far more than he'd like to admit. I know, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 says, mumbling a little. I just don't know how I should do this. I don't think I can ask him anything without explaining why I need it, or what I am. And I don't want to put you in danger because I slipped up and told him about you. First of all, 𝐬𝐡𝐤, you're 14. You don't have to worry about putting me in danger. The only person we should worry about being in danger is you, Yagi says matter-of-factly. I can take care of myself, so don't worry about that. 𝐀𝐻 looks like she has some opinions about that, which is fair considering the amount of times this woman has fed him and sent him home with food, because his idea of what constituted a healthy meal wildly differed from her own. Not to mention his more than occasionally showing up late and bleeding, and somehow still wondering why she makes such a fuss. Also, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 continues, I don't want to lie to him. I don't want to trick him into doing something for me when he doesn't even know what's going on. That's not fair. I don't want to use him like that. Yagi makes a face. Fair point, he allows, grimacing. 𝐬𝐡𝐤, 𝐀𝐻 says, getting her son's attention. Do you trust 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬? 𝐬𝐡𝐤 just blinks at her, at first, but nods soon after. Do you think he would tell anyone if you told him? 𝐀𝐻 asks. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 thinks for a moment. No, he answers, a little surprised about how confident in that he is. He wouldn't tell anyone. You should try and talk to him about it, then, 𝐀𝐻 says. He'll probably understand more than you think he does. But, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 protests, albeit feebly. What about Mr. Yagi? If you trust him, I trust him, Yagi says, flashing a grin at him. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 can feel his eyes watering, and he dies a little at the thought of Happy crying in front of his hero-turned-teacher. But even with their reassurances, it still doesn't make talking to 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 about this any easier. It's June, and coming towards the end of the first semester. The warm weather has made his classmates lazy, and antsy, itching to get outside. Things are good with 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬, the best they've ever been. They walk to and from school together. They sit together in class and at lunch, and they talk, though it's mostly 𝐬𝐡𝐤 babbling and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 making agreeable noises every once in a while. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 isn't particularly talkative unless you get him started on something he actively likes. Then he'll talk your ear right off. It's been interesting, we're learning things about each other, getting to know each other again. They still like a lot of the same things, as it turns out, which is a joy and relief to 𝐬𝐡𝐤. They can't really hang out, with how busy 𝐬𝐡𝐤 is with his tutor, but they play a lot of games together online, and voice chat and text and the like. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 is more than understanding about his tutor. As it turns out, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 himself had been getting the shit kicked out of him, as he put it, and getting help with training from his mom. They're both trying their hardest to get into UA, so it only makes sense that he'd get outside help, too. But more importantly, this presents an opportunity for 𝐬𝐡𝐤. What is she helping you with? he asks him one day over Discord. They're messing around in creative mode on Minecraft currently, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬 had spent the time it took them to pack up and walk home from school complaining about how his mom didn't pull any punches, even when it came to her own kid. And Izuku isn't sure how 𝐻𝐡𝐬 is even the least bit surprised about this when he is exactly the same way. He had resumed complaining about it the minute they both managed to get into the voice channel and resumed what they were doing the last time they were on at the same time, which was leveling an entire mountain range to the ground for the fuck of it. He says it's to help Izuku make room for his next project, but Izuku has his doubts. Mitsuki, as it turns out, is helping him with what is more or less strength training, and the finer points of being a wolf, showing him how to fight without his wolf skin, how to wear it only on individual parts of his body as opposed to the whole of it, how to keep his mind human in the thick of battle and bloodlust, but most importantly, how to summon up this gift and his father's without being consumed by it. Izuku presses him for answers, insatiably curious, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬, surprisingly enough, gives him a straight answer. It's the pack bond, 𝐻𝐡𝐬 explains a little gruffly. For shades of 𝐻𝐡𝐬, this is pretty gentle. Currently, he is carefully lining up dynamite blocks, so that when he lights the first one, they will blow each one down the line in a chain reaction. It is, according to 𝐻𝐡𝐬, incredibly soothing. Just them physically being there helps a lot. It was really hard not to get overwhelmed by it at first, just 'cause there's so much, like, I don't know, latent energy, he decides. So the bond helps spread it out a little more so it's not, like, all-consuming. A pause. 𝐻𝐡𝐬 hesitates. I don't know if I could do it without the pack bond. Izuku isn't sure what to say to that. 𝐻𝐡𝐬 has been very careful thus far in his re-befriending of Izuku to not show any more vulnerability than he physically has to, and the fact that he's now doing it at Izuku's request is revolutionary. Izuku is touched at this, but it's short-lived. There's a pause as 𝐻𝐡𝐬 lines up the last one in the line and ignites it, and it sets off so many at once that the server lags. The village that Izuku had been working on gets caught in the crossfire, and there's a nice, shiny new crater on the edge of town for him to fill in. Oh my god, Izuku complains. He can hear 𝐻𝐡𝐬 muffle his snickering. Izuku groans, but the moment passes, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬 gets to work setting up the next row of dynamite. Izuku, meanwhile, fills in the hole with dirt. Thank you for telling me that, Izuku says after a moment. I know it's really hard for you to. Don't fucking make it weird, 𝐻𝐡𝐬 grumbles, interrupting him. He stops lining up his dynamite blocks for a minute to help Izuku fill in the crater. Besides, that's what friends do, right? Tell each other things or some shit. Another pause. And it's not like you're gonna go run off and tell anyone, 𝐻𝐡𝐬 mumbles. Izuku grins from ear to ear. You're right, I wouldn't, Izuku replies. And I know you wouldn't tell anyone my stuff, either. 𝐻𝐡𝐬 huffs. What did I just fucking say about not making it weird, he grumps. There's no bite in it, and Izuku snickers back at him. 𝐻𝐡𝐬 groans in exaggerated anguish, and leaves him to his crater. Izuku then very abruptly has the realization that if 𝐻𝐡𝐬 couldn't first access his power without help from his pack bond, then he, himself, probably couldn't either. And the wolf means an actual pack bond, formed by magic and blood, rather than the human tendency to imprint on every living creature it sees. Which means that Izuku probably can't do this without 𝐻𝐡𝐬, being that 𝐻𝐡𝐬 is the wolf in this situation, and the one who bit him in the first place. This thought is incredibly exhausting and exasperating, and his silence is so sudden and so stark that 𝐻𝐡𝐬 notices it too. Sorry, 𝐻𝐡𝐬 says, all at once subdued. What? No, you're okay, Izuku scrambles to reassure. No, I just remembered something my tutor wanted me to work on. I'm not upset with you or anything. Okay, 𝐻𝐡𝐬 replies. His disbelief is palpable. He's probably already gearing up to quietly sulk and punish himself for fucking up, as he calls it. He probably thinks he's being subtle about it, too. No, really, Izuku asserts. I'm not upset with you. I seriously did just remember something my tutor wants me to work on. Izuku swallows, and then does something very impulsive. It kind of involves you, actually. Yeah? He asks, interest piqued. How so? This seems to distract Katsuki from wallowing for the time being. Now comes the tricky part, actually explaining the situation at hand. Katsuki, as it stands, already has a general but limited understanding of what was going on. He knew that Izuku wasn't exactly giftless, and he knew that 𝐀𝐦 was teaching him witchcraft, and that his tutor was somehow involved in it. He didn't know Izuku's tutor was Yagi, and he certainly didn't know what sort of creature he was exactly. Izuku knows sort of distantly that he was probably going to learn this, and that this would probably greatly alter his opinion of him. But he charges ahead before the anxiety of the unknown can get to him. Katsuki won't betray his secret if he learns of it, and Izuku knows this. They literally just went over this. Besides, Izuku thinks darkly. It's not like anyone would believe him. You know how my mom's been teaching me witch stuff? Izuku starts, voice relatively even, given the situation. Which is to say, not at all. He tried. Yeah? Katsuki prompts. Well, my tutor has been teaching me stuff about magic, too, and Izuku says, wavering. He thinks that, my magic was altered, somehow, when you bit me, and that I won't be able to reach its full potential. Unless you help me, I mean. Yeah. This doesn't stretch the truth too much, admittedly. But Izuku still falters, feeling guilty somehow. He's got to do this in small steps. Too much at once. And Katsuki definitely wouldn't believe him. It'd probably be easier to explain if I just showed you, he finishes lamely. I know that wasn't very good of an explanation. Katsuki doesn't say anything for a minute, and his avatar in-game doesn't move an inch. The nervousness that Izuku had been holding back now wells up in full force. Kaken, he calls, not quite able to swallow it back down. You still there? Katsuki continues to not say anything, and Izuku is unable to let things be, so he fills the void with his own babble instead. I mean, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. I'll figure something out. Did I stunt your magic? Katsuki chokes out, finally. It derails Izuku a bit. Sorry, what? He replies, dazed. When I bit you, did it stunt your magic? Katsuki asks, 𝐀𝐦. His voice has an edge to it, but it's directed only towards himself. And Izuku has this moment of eerie clarity where he can suddenly recognize all the signs of an incoming panic attack, now that he's on the outside of it for once instead of being trapped within. And he knows that right now, telling Katsuki to calm down directly isn't going to work. They're going to have to work up to a point where he can, first, and to do that, he needs as close to the truth as Izuku can give him. You didn't stunt it, Kaken, Izuku explains evenly. Gentle, but not too gentle that would be seen as patronizing, which is the worst possible thing you could to do Katsuki. Sure, you changed it, yeah, but I would have been a late bloomer no matter what. You couldn't have stunted it with that. That's not how it works. Katsuki makes noise that sounds like he's choking, and Izuku can't see his face and therefore can't tell if it's disbelief, rage, or both. Knowing Katsuki, it's probably both. Kaken, I don't care about the bite, Izuku tells him. Even back when it happened, I never blamed you for it. The only thing he really cared about was why Katsuki all of a sudden stopped talking to him and started treating him differently. But they've already moved past that. Bringing it up now is just salt in wounds so recently healed. Not that bringing up the bite was much better, but the air needed to be cleared. I don't believe you, Katsuki rasps out. He struggles with his next few words. Izuku waits for him to finish. I can't believe you, right now. You almost died because of my stupid mistake. I don't fucking understand how you can't care about this. You were just trying to help me, Izuku says. We were like 4. We couldn't have predicted what happened. Izuku, I fucked up bad. Please just let me be angry that I fucked up that bad, Katsuki snaps. Don't try and fucking comfort me for hurting you. or throwing a fit. His breathing has gotten a bit rough. Sorry, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 spits. Sorry, I'll be fine in a bit. Just let me be angry right now. I'll fucking deal with it. Okay, Izuku says calmly. There really isn't much to be done with it right now. They'll get there when they get there. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 takes a deep breath, and it comes out a little shaky. Okay, he echoes. Okay. The voice chat is silent for a few minutes, each of them returning to their projects in turn. Izuku was debating on asking whether or not 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 wanted to be alone for a bit, when the wolf speaks up again, still furious with himself. I'm fucking pissed because you keep acting like you don't matter, like your life doesn't matter, when it does, and I don't know how to get you to see that, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 says, the words rushing out of him all at once. You're acting like it doesn't matter that you almost fucking died. Yeah, it was a stupid mistake, but it was still one where you could have died. I don't fucking deserve your forgiveness. I haven't done jack shit to earn it. And don't say that I don't have to, because I do. You deserve so much better than me. That's fair, Izuku replies after a moment, mulling it over. After another moment, in case he wasn't clear, he says, I still want to be friends with you. I don't get that either, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 says. But yeah, same, I guess. A moment passes. I'm not mad at you, I'm just mad. Sorry. Izuku almost restarts the entire goddamn thing by saying it's okay, which would have been to date the dumbest thing he could have done, including running headlong into a dark alley with nothing but a jar of salt to protect himself with. I accept your apology, he says, instead. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 exhales again, and it comes out a little better this time. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 starts again. You are worth something, okay? To be honest, Izuku is still trying to wrap his head around that one. But he'll try. Okay, Izuku says. It's quiet again for a bit, right up until 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 finishes another line of dynamite, and the server lags again. Oh my god, 𝐀𝐦, Izuku complains, and he can hear the tiniest snicker through his headphones, barely even a puff of air against the mic. He completely forgets about what he asked of 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 until he's getting into bed and receives a text on his phone. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 says, yeah, I'll help you with the thing. Izuku falls asleep with his phone in his hand, but he manages to send out a thank you with far too many exclamation points before passing out. Izuku wakes up the next day and realizes he has no idea what he's going to tell Yagi. He also realizes he has no idea what he's going to tell 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬. Objectively, he probably should have waited to ask Yagi before telling 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 anything about this, but he's already made his bed, and now it's time to lie in it. Time passes strangely at school. It feels like it's going at a crawl, but he's somehow still running out of it. Seconds feeling like hours and hours feeling like seconds. Lunch comes, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 comes and sits with him like he usually does, and Izuku still has no idea what to tell him. So how is this going to work? 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 asks once he puts down his tray. Izuku replies intelligently. He did actually put some thought into this one, and had worked something out in his head. But the problem was less about having a plan, which he always did, for everything, and more about making it work. Still, it would probably be good to let 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 in on it. I think you'd just be coming over after school on Fridays and Saturdays, he suggests. That's when my tutor had staked out working on this by ourselves, so it'd make sense to just have you come help then. Starting today? 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 asks. Izuku blinks at him puzzledly before belatedly realizing, oh right, it's Friday. Why yeah, if that's not a problem, he stutters. I don't know what you're doing with your mom, or if that will interrupt your work, or, yeah, that's fine, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 says. Oh, good, Izuku says. It's not good. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 hasn't been to his house since before they moved. Hell, he hasn't been there since the bite. In theory, his mom should be alright with him since she made up with Mitsuki and Masaru. But Izuku hasn't had anyone over at all since then, not even just 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬. What do you need help with exactly? 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 asks, oddly patient. Maybe it's only odd because Izuku is still half expecting this entire thing to fall to pieces any minute now. Mostly just tapping into my magic without it hurting me, Izuku says. My tutor can explain it better once we get home. Katsuki makes an affirmative noise around the food in his mouth. Izuku elects to bite the bullet and send a text off to his mom and Yagi telling him that he's bringing Katsuki home after school. More accurately, he asks, while painstakingly make it seem as casual as possible. Because in theory, if he doesn't act like it's a big deal, they won't act like it's a big deal. This is, of course, fundamentally incorrect. Izuku sends to the both of them. Is it alright if Katsuki, my wolf friend, comes over after school and helps today? Inko is quick to reply with, it's alright with me as long as it's alright with Mr. Yagi. And Yagi replies, with an alarming amount of emoticons, sounds good to me. On one hand, this is relieving, because now he won't have to go home and try to explain to Yagi why all of a sudden there's a wolf on their doorstep. But on the other hand, now there's really no turning back. Time passes even quicker after lunch, slipping through his fingers like sand through a sieve, and they're very nearly back to his apartment when the gravity of the situation really hits him. They stopped at Katsuki's house on the way, so he could get changed out of his uniform and tell his parents where he'd be, and Izuku had been quite content to wait outside on his doorstep while he got ready. But this apparently had never been an option. Katsuki opens the door wide enough that his parents see Izuku standing there awkwardly on their welcome mat, and practically drag him into the house. Katsuki leaves him to their mercy while he runs upstairs to get changed, and Izuku remembers how aggressively doting the Bakugos are. He's there hardly 10 minutes total, and he's still got a cup of tea in his hands, courtesy of Masaru, without actually knowing when he brewed the tea in the time he was there, and when it was actually placed in his hands. Mitsuki, meanwhile, seems to be hell-bent on rearranging every individual hair on his head, judging by how much she ruffles it. Katsuki doesn't leave him for too long, thankfully. Mom, what the fuck? He shouts as he stomps down the stairs. Mitsuki shows no sign of stopping and no sign of regret, leveling her son with a fearless stare and looking very much like the cat that caught the canary. Lay off him, God. He grabs Izuku's wrist and drags him back out of the house, Izuku barely managing to deposit the half-empty teacup into awaiting Masaru's hands. Don't stay out too late, Masaru calls. Katsuki groans loudly in response and slams the door closed behind them. I can't fucking believe her. What the fuck? Katsuki complains, gritting it through his teeth. Oh, it's no big deal. I don't mind, Izuku assures. And it's true, he doesn't, even if they were oddly eager about it. She was trying to fucking mark you, Katsuki grumbles. She wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. She's so embarrassing. Oh, Izuku replies, and that's about all he can say to that. There's too many reasons he can list off the top of his head for why she could be doing that. And he knows his information on the subject is too limited to be able to correctly pick out why. There's hardly any information to be found on werewolves, or at least not in terms of social interaction. Wolves tended to keep to themselves and their own communities, and were very wary of any outsiders. The Bakugos are something of an anomaly, just the three of them living far beyond the reach of any clan's territory. Izuku had heard of wolves being cast out of their packs, banished from their own clans and homeland, but that typically didn't end well for the wolf in question. Typically, it ended with them just disappearing one day, with no one seeing them ever again. Rarer was the chance of them surviving, and that usually came at the cost of fleeing from their homes before they could be caught and struck down by their own kin. Neither Katsuki's parents nor Izuku's own had made any reference as to how they came to live here, or how an alpha in her prime, and an exceptionally powerful one at that, came to wed a demon instead of another wolf. Katsuki's never said anything, and Izuku's never asked. It just wasn't important where Katsuki came from when they were younger, and up until this point, it had just never occurred to him that this arrangement was particularly strange. It's never seemed strange to him. She's acting like you're her fucking kid. God, I can't stand her. Katsuki continues to complain, and that about clears it up. Izuku is relatively quiet the rest of the way there, and this doesn't go unnoticed. Izuku is pressing the button for the elevator in his building when Katsuki asks him, "You okay?" Izuku replies, which does not at all build confidence. Katsuki makes a face at him. "There's something you should know about my tutor." Izuku tries again. "It's sort of hard to explain. It'll be better once we get there." Katsuki squints at him. "If you say so," he says, unconvinced. This buys him some time, but things come to a head, as they always do. And it starts when Izuku opens the door to his apartment and Katsuki freezes in place, stiff as a board. "What the fuck?" he wheezes. Now, this could be for any number of reasons. Yagi's infamous red cloak hanging off of the rack next to the door, for example, or the man himself moseying about the kitchen, helping 𝐀𝐦 put away groceries. But it is neither of those things. In fact, the thing that brings everything to a head is the fact that Katsuki is a wolf. Katsuki can smell him and recognize him from that, even in his current form of skin and bones. "Hello there," Yagi greets, voice bigger than his body would suggest. It carries throughout the apartment and seems to hit Katsuki square in the chest for how he stumbles back from it. "Izuku, close the door, honey," 𝐀𝐦 reminds gently, and this stirs her son into action, dragging Katsuki into the apartment and closing the door behind them. He drags Katsuki further in with a hand around his wrist, but gets no further than the kitchen table before Katsuki seems to come back to himself. "You're the fucker from the hospital," Katsuki snarls, pointing an accusing finger at Yagi. "You were the one who fucking showed up in the middle of the night before my dad got there." Yagi looks a little shell-shocked, though Izuku can't tell if it's from Katsuki's usual niceties or him figuring it out in one. "Ah," Yagi replies a little redundantly. "Yes, I am." A pause. "You were awake for that, I take it." "I thought I just fucking dreamed that," Katsuki says incredulously. He's not quite yelling, but still well on his way there. "Kaken, this is my tutor, Mr. Yagi," Izuku says, trying his best to be the rational one here. I'm apprenticing under him, actually," he admits, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. Katsuki looks at him like he grew a second head. "What the fuck?" he says again, with feeling. "What the shit?" "Maybe it would be best if you sit down, sweetie," 𝐀𝐦 says gently, pulling out a chair for him. Izuku takes the coward's way out. He runs to go get changed out of his school uniform. He's not proud of it, but he couldn't stand to be in the same room while they tell the boy wolf exactly what's been going on, especially since he's still half convinced that he's going to take off any minute. Now, things like this don't typically go well for Izuku. The fact that they've made it this far is nothing short of a miracle. He tries not to linger in his room too long, however. Unfortunately for him, they apparently had decided to wait for him to return before getting started. His mother is just now pouring tea for the four of them, her own blend, from the smell of it. That's something she had picked up again, too, in teaching her son witchcraft. His mother, who seems to be hell-bent on destroying him, and pulls out the chair next to Katsuki for him to sit. Katsuki, to his credit, has calmed down somewhat, or at least isn't yelling, despite him still looking largely wild-eyed and manic. Well, it was nice while it lasted, Izuku supposes. "There you are, my boy," Yagi greets affectionately, ruffling Izuku's hair. This does not at all help Katsuki in calming down. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku can see him mouth the words "what the fuck" at him. "I was just about to tell young Bakugo about the hospital visit." "Why, yeah?" Izuku replies, feeling Katsuki's eyes bore into him. Yagi nods. "I had begun to suspect from our first encounter that he and I were the same," he goes on to explain. "But coming back for a second time, and seeing how you handled that slime, it confirmed my suspicions. So when I learned what hospital you were staying at, I knew I had to make things right." He pauses a moment, exhaling. "I just couldn't stand what I'd said to you earlier, Izuku," he continues, apologetic. "I should never had said those things to you. Being a guardian has nothing to do with the talents you possess, it's the strength of will. and the willingness to put everything on the line to protect the people around you. That makes a good guardian. I'm just sorry that I forgot that, and that I hurt you because of it. It's okay, Mr. Yagi, Izuku assures, vision blurring only a little bit. I would have taken you as my apprentice, either way, Yagi tells him unwaveringly. Beacon or no beacon. Your spirit and drive are nothing to be trifled with. The fuck you do you mean, beacon? Katsuki asks, brusquely reminding them that he was there. It is a creature unlike any other, Yagi says, with a bit of a dramatic flair. Katsuki squints at him suspiciously. While others may have their gifts from the start, a beacon's magic comes from the gifts they receive from others. For this is their gift, to share their magic with others, and to have magic shared with them. Katsuki's eyes go wide. So when I bit him, he cuts off, staring at Izuku, something fervent in his red eyes. Yes, young Bakugo, Yagi tells him. When you bit him, you may not have turned him, but you gave him a gift, all the same. And that gift is why we needed you here tonight, young wolf. Izuku cannot unlock its full potential without your help. Nobody says anything for a couple seconds, his mother and Yagi carefully watching Katsuki, and Katsuki openly staring at Izuku. Izuku looks away, and can't leave the empty space by itself. So, he starts. You said that you needed a pack bond to be able to use your demon fire? Yeah, Katsuki replies, startling out of a daze. So we should work on that first, I guess. And I don't need it. It just makes things easier, he defends a little grumpily. I must admit, young Bakugo, I am not all that familiar with the finer details of a wolf's gifts, Yagi says, curious. How does it work, exactly? Well, you wouldn't know, Katsuki tells him plainly. Full-blooded wolves don't like anybody except other full-blooded wolves. They're not gonna tell you shit. The only reason I even know is because of my mom. And it's hard to explain. It's always been there for me. I've never not had it. I was born with it or some shit. But I know that turned wolves are supposed to get it, too, once they finish turning. Yagi frowns. I don't know if that's going to work here, he admits. Izuku's not going to turn into anything. He is what he is. But I have something, Izuku persists. I still have the fire. I have something. We can still try. Are you sure, Izuku? Inko asks warily. Every time we've tried, it's only burned you. We didn't have 𝐀𝐦 before, he says adamantly. I still want to try. Okay, what are you doing when you try and call up the fire? Katsuki asks, straightforward. Just that, Izuku replies. I didn't think there was anything else to it. Katsuki huffs. Of course that's not all there fucking is to it, he snaps. It's not that easy. Fuck. You're supposed to be thinking of something to anchor you. Like home or family or something. God. Inko's facial expression doesn't change, but the look she sends Katsuki is somehow withering. Sorry I yelled, he grumbles. You're working on it, Izuku says, lenient. Okay, I'm going to try that now. Izuku closes his eyes. He starts the way he usually does. When calling forth this fire, he starts with a scar. It doesn't hurt him now. It hasn't in years. But he remembers when it did. Remembers when the pale, shimmering skin was still freshly punctured flesh. A dull throb on his shoulder. Instead of moving on to the pain and the fever, he moves past it and thinks of his loved ones instead. He thinks of his mother and her potted plant garden and her homegrown tea leaves. He thinks of the strand of bells hanging from the front door and the scents wafting from the kitchen when she cooks dinner. He thinks of her dark hair and green eyes and all the other things of herself she passed on to her son. He thinks of Yagi, of the bright scarlet of his cloak, of the soft, golden fur lining it, and the frail man within the powerful frame. He thinks of Yagi's worn hands ruffling his hair. He thinks of how many times he's dozed off on the couch when it got too late, and woke up with Yagi's cloak covering him. He thinks of his wild, golden hair, of his fierce blue eyes, of his booming laugh. thundering out of him and his shrunken body. He thinks of Mitsuki and being herded into the back of her car. He thinks of the radio, of her voice when she sings along to the tune, of the scent of her morning coffee in the cup holder just next to her. He thinks of Masaru and his watchful gaze. He thinks of the warmth that radiates from him and fills every room he steps in. He thinks of the teacup carefully pressed into his hands mere hours before, seemingly conjured from nothing but the perfect temperature, just the same. He thinks of Katsuki. He thinks of before, when they were younger, when he kept his window open for him and let the young wolf inside. He thinks of the full moon in summer, in autumn, in winter and spring. And he thinks of company he kept for each one. He thinks of their games, of their sleepovers, of Katsuki's scent and little hands around his own. He thinks of now, of Katsuki in the cafeteria clumsily shoving his apology at Izuku's feet. He thinks of the conquests left on his balcony, placed carefully away from the potted plant garden. And he thinks of Katsuki baring his teeth at those who would try and come after him. Now, he thinks of their walks to school and back. He thinks of their talks in class and out. He thinks of his own name in Katsuki's mouth. He thinks of Katsuki's in his. Something slides into place. Then, a strange sort of current suddenly lit up between them, faint but steady. It feels a little bit like putting a dislocated limb back in place, sore, tender. And he knows it will be for some time. But the worst is over. It feels like it can get better. Now, it's in the place it should be. His hands are warm like Katsuki's little hands. Warm like teacups and coffee mugs, like the soft lilt of a song and the thunderous boom of a laugh. Izuku opens his eyes. It's not much nothing compared to the flames he's seen wreathed around Katsuki's mane, but there is a tiny glimmer of flame held in his palms, as if burning from some unseen candlewick. Tiny, but as bright a green as his own eyes and his mother's, light filling all corners of the room, and still a flame, no more and no less. Izuku, his mother says fondly, proudly, her eyes and cheeks already pink with unshed tears. My boy, Yagi says softly, reverently. You've done it. Izuku's heart flutters, and so does his flame, flickering and growing under their praise, turning iridescent before their eyes. He can't hold it for long, he's too anxious, too excited, and it sputters out. But he held it. He called it. He was not burned. He looks to Katsuki, suddenly timid and unsure. Katsuki looks at him as though he's seeing him, truly, for the first time. Katsuki looks at him and Izuku knows he sees home and family, because this is what Izuku sees when he looks at him. Izuku had lost the flame for hardly more than a moment before Katsuki has his hand hooked around his forearm. He's a little rough and a little sudden, but there is no malice intended, merely content to hold him there. There's sparks flying from Katsuki's hair, the way they used to when they were younger, and he can't seem to do much else besides stare at Izuku, fumbling both at him and the connection between them once severed, now restored. Holy shit, Katsuki mumbles. You're here. I can see you. Well, yeah, Izuku starts to say. But he can't quite get the words out before something Katsuki probably grasps hold of this connection and pulls, and he jerks forward, tugged along by something unseen wrapped around his ribcage. His head lands somewhere on Katsuki's shoulder, probably much harder than he means to, still a little stunned. I can see you, Katsuki says again, next to his ear and just as awestruck as the first time. Izuku understand now. Yeah, he says. That night, he doesn't get it much bigger than a candlewick. But that's fine, he supposes. He doesn't hurt himself, and when he edges too close to the fever, Katsuki is there to drag him back to himself, no matter how far gone he is. The night comes to an end when the Bakugos come to pick up their son and take him home. Both of them show up, which is odd, because from what Izuku understands, typically they trust Katsuki to take care of himself and walk home on his own. Katsuki is exceptionally strong, with a mind and senses sharp as a tack, so normally, this is enough by itself, but Izuku supposes that was before the incident with the slime creature. Things may have changed after that. 𝐻𝐸 attempts to make himself scarce, perhaps to preserve his identity. But 𝐀𝐻 puts a stop to that right quick. 𝐘𝐻𝐬's parents deserve to know what you're getting their son into, she had said, scolding. Her voice only wavers a little bit. She's getting better at being strong by herself. Still, it's enough to get 𝐻𝐸 to reconsider, and so he stays late enough to meet them, twiddling his fingers nervously. 𝐘𝐻𝐬, meanwhile, has taken it upon himself to pin Izuku to the living room couch with a hand on his leg, physically putting himself between Izuku and the door. Izuku is relatively sure that Mitsuki would be pleased to have him be pack officially, but 𝐘𝐻𝐬 seems to think otherwise. I'm not fucking leaving you again, 𝐘𝐻𝐬 says fiercely. I'm not going to let them take you from me. Sparks keep flying from his hair and skin intermittently, and he looks a little unhinged. Izuku knows next to nothing about werewolf physiology, but he thinks it's pretty safe to say that 𝐘𝐻𝐬's instincts are going haywire. This is confirmed when Mitsuki buzzes to be let in, and 𝐘𝐻𝐬 throws an arm across his chest, pinning him fully to the couch. He's doing an awfully good impression of a revving motorcycle right now. Izuku can feel his growling reverberate through the whole couch. This only worsens when Mitsuki and Masaru finally arrive. Knocking at the door, his mother lets them in, and it almost seems fake, them exchanging greetings and pleasantries with 𝐀𝐻. Masaru asks about her and Izuku, the apartment, and how they've been holding up, and Mitsuki laughs and teases and plays like their friendship had never been severed in the first place. The only thing keeping Izuku in the present is 𝐘𝐻𝐬's growling, and 𝐻𝐸 standing awkwardly in the kitchen, unsure of how to approach. Mitsuki makes the decision for him. She makes her way over to the living room, unbothered by 𝐘𝐻𝐬's growling. She looks the two of them up and down, and 𝐘𝐻𝐬 not so subtly pushes Izuku further down the couch and away from her. I'm not going to try and separate you two again, so cut that out, brat, she says, half scolding and half playful. Really? Izuku asks, once 𝐘𝐻𝐬's growling has petered out. He's still pinning him to the couch, however. Not like it worked all that great the first time around, Mitsuki replies, laughing a little. You two still managed to get each other into trouble, anyhow. Might as well actually let it happen and stick around to keep you two safe, instead of trying to keep you apart and watching you destroy everything in between. Izuku likes to think that applies more to 𝐘𝐻𝐬 than him. But he also dumped an entire jar of purifying salt on a monster he had no business being around, because it was hurting 𝐘𝐻𝐬, so there's that. Besides, she continues, looking Izuku in the eye, there's a strange pull again, but gentler this time. Its presence softer and more sure of itself. He can feel a hand around his heart, and it warms him to the core. There's a certain inquisitiveness about this presence, playful, curious, but expansive, Izuku just scratching the surface of its depth. He knows it's Mitsuki from the sureness of it, her touch nurturing and protective at once. He's had a small but constant awareness of the tie between him and 𝐘𝐻𝐬 for a while now, since it had slid back into place, but Mitsuki being nearby only highlights it. He thinks, perhaps, if he were to close his eyes, he would see the web of strands connecting them. He to 𝐘𝐻𝐬 and 𝐘𝐻𝐬 to his mother. Perhaps even Mitsuki to her husband. He'd only see them faintly, but they'd still be there, he thinks. I don't think we'll be able to separate you two this time, she finishes, laughing. She finally turns to look at 𝐻𝐸, standing in the kitchen and watching the exchange with equal parts concern and interest. 𝐘𝐻𝐬 relaxes marginally now that his mother's gaze is no longer on Izuku. Now, who might you be? She asks. I'm young Izuku's tutor, 𝐻𝐸 says. Mitsuki raises her eyebrows at him. Oh, she says, smiling like she's already in on it. He extends a hand to her. 𝐻𝐸 Toshinori, he says, introducing himself. Pleasure to meet you. She doesn't hesitate in taking his hand, giving him a big grin in return. Oh, so you're that 𝐻𝐸, then, Mitsuki says, amused. Bakugo Mitsuki. Pleasure to meet you, too. That cloak by the door yours, then? He nods, smiling weakly as tension begins to visibly ebb away. Yes, he replies. I apologize for the secrecy, but it's necessary for young Izuku's safety. It's all right. I figured as much, Mitsuki assures him. He gives her an odd look. You don't seem very surprised by any of this, he observes. I could smell you on Izu-kun after you visited him in the hospital, she says pointedly. Yagi stiffens. And each time you were around after that. He chokes a little. I see, he wheezes. You should really look into something to block your scent from wolves. It's a dead giveaway, she explains. My husband can probably enchant your cloak with something like that if you like. True to form, Masaru is already examining the cloak, tutting at a side seam whose stitches had become worn. I don't usually encounter wolves, Yagi replies carefully. It didn't seem necessary at the time. That's true, Izuku notes. Typically, wolves police their own communities, and were incredibly secretive and territorial. They didn't take kindly to outsiders or even non-wolves, and very rarely did any wolves actually live outside of wolf territory, let alone as well as the Bakugos have. Izuku can count the amount of documented times Yagi has had to guard against wolves on one hand, and he can't even call those typical encounters either. They were usually so far gone and so powerful with corruption that the pack they had fled from couldn't stop them. By the time Yagi had gotten to them, they were mindless beasts needing to be cut down. Fair, Mitsuki allows. And I know we're not exactly what you'd call a regular pack. That being said, she pauses, and it's almost as if a switch has been flipped. Pleasantries gone in an instant. What are your intentions for Izuku? She asks, still smiling, technically. But now it's more a faint baring of teeth, letting Yagi know she is not to be trifled with, especially not when one of her own is involved. The mood of the room has changed completely, charged with a strange sort of energy. Katsuki is still keeping his hand on Izuku, but now he seems to be putting himself between him and Yagi, rather than his mother. Masaru, similarly, has subtly put himself between Yagi and 𝐴𝐻. Mitsuki might have cast aside her original pack, but she fiercely guards the one she has now. Masaru and his son now both watch Yagi with wary eyes. And maybe Izuku was foolish not to look harder for the connection between Mitsuki and 𝐴𝐻, or between himself and his mother. I have taken him on as my apprentice, Yagi explains, holding steady in the wake of Mitsuki's crushing pressure. Of course Katsuki would have inherited this talent from his mother. With 𝐴𝐻's permission, of course. The pressure wanes somewhat, the wolf satisfied with this answer. She nods. And what would you have of my son? She asks. I would like him to help Izuku in his training. There are certain aspects of it that only he can aid in, Yagi tells her firmly. Katsuki puffs up proudly at these words, but does not waver from his post. Mitsuki has taught her son well. I would ask for your permission for this as well, Yagi adds. Aspects such as, Mitsuki asks, not quite a challenge but close. She hasn't broken eye contact with Yagi since she started, and neither has Yagi. Izuku suspects she's pleased with this. However, 𝐴𝐻 seems to think they've all dealt with enough of this for the day, and that it was time to handle this like responsible adults. She manages to walk around Masaru, who doesn't stop her, and right up to Mitsuki, putting a hand on her shoulder. I think this would be easier to explain if we all sat down and discussed this as a group, 𝐴𝐻 suggests, gently but firmly. Mitsuki grins at her, and Izuku thinks she's pleased with this, most of all. It takes a strong will to stand up to an alpha wolf, and his mother is nothing if not strong. After 𝐴𝐻 has gotten the Bakugos to settle down and settle in at the kitchen table, which has gotten quite a bit crowded now that 5 people sit around it, she proceeds to serve them tea and coffee, breaking open a tin of cookies she baked earlier that week. It's only then that she sits down as well, Yagi pulling out her chair for her next to him. Izuku is on her other side, and Katsuki on his, the boy wolf still stubbornly putting himself between Izuku and his parents. Masaru on Katsuki's other side and Mitsuki on Yagi's chat idly with each other, and with Izuku and Yagi, asking about school and work, and teasing Katsuki whenever they have a chance. Mitsuki lavishes 𝐀𝐻 with praise, which she sputters and denies, which leads to Masaru joining in, and Yagi as well. It actually takes quite a bit of time to get to the matter at hand. But by the time they do, the atmosphere has become relaxed and domestic. Mitsuki may not have been surprised at Yagi's involvement, but she certainly was at Izuku's gift. Mitsuki staring in open wonder as Izuku managed to conjure forth his fire one more time. Both she and Masaru are radiating pride, the demon especially, lavishing Izuku with praise as well. Green is an exceptionally rare color for that, he explains. But you're pretty rare yourself, he adds, teasing a little. It's to be expected. I think it's a little presumptive to expect this sort of responsibility from Katsuki, Masaru tells the adults at the table plainly. He's still learning himself, and Izuku needs to learn from a proper teacher. Katsuki, too, for that matter. Katsuki does what cannot be described as anything but a pout, though calling it that out loud would almost certainly draw his ire. What are you suggesting, exactly, Mr. Bakugo? Yagi asks, though he looks like he already knows the answer to that question, regrettably. That Mitsuki and I get involved, naturally, he says. Mitsuki can teach the ways of being a wolf, but I think it's more important that we focus on controlling the fire, at least for Izuku. Not that Katsuki doesn't need it, too, but it's more of a matter of health and well-being for Izuku. True, Yagi admits a little grudgingly. Demon fire can be quite volatile if not handled correctly, and you would know better than me how to control it. Exactly, Masaru nods. That being said, Yagi says, there are still things that only Katsuki can help with. He gave this gift to Izuku, so it is his intention that shapes it first. And while you bring up good points, and I certainly welcome your help, the gift Izuku received is both demon and wolf, and to separate them into different entities goes against what his magic is at its core. It's the unity of these things that makes your son so powerful, and the gift Izuku received from him so different. Fair enough, Masaru allows. The Bakugos linger for some time longer, Yagi answering whatever questions he can. But eventually it does come time for both of them to head home. During the exchange of goodbyes, Izuku notes that Mitsuki is somehow even less subtle than she normally is, making no attempt to hide that she was marking Izuku and his mother with her scent. She hugs 𝐀𝐻 closely, palms on his mother's wrists when she first pulls her in for it. She ruffles Izuku's hair before she hugs him, grinning with obvious intent, and Katsuki groans loudly about how embarrassing she is. The irony of him proceeding to do just the same, hand placed firmly on the back of Izuku's neck as he barks out a gruff goodbye, is somehow lost on him. Masaru takes his son, after peeling him off of Izuku, and goes straight home, and Mitsuki walks Yagi to the train station before heading home afterwards. 𝐀𝐻 and Izuku clean up the kitchen in the silence, and 𝐀𝐻 sends Izuku off to bed, because excitement or not, he still had school tomorrow. But Izuku does not feel lonely in the wake of their leaving, the Bakugos and Yagi filling up so much space in their tiny apartment. He does not, because he can close his eyes and still feel the connection tethering him to Katsuki's mother and father, and to Izuku's own mother. He can close his eyes and still feel a hand around his heart, grasping gently but unwilling to let go. The next day and the days to follow go a little strangely. At first, Izuku wakes up, gets ready, and leaves for school only to find Katsuki waiting for him outside his apartment building. There was no discussion of this beforehand, no warning. But Katsuki still acts like Izuku kept him waiting on purpose. The boy wolf seems to be a mix of impatient and embarrassed, griping at him for taking so long to get his ass in gear, but not appearing to notice that the tips of his ears have gone red, or perhaps ignoring that they have. Katsuki drags him by his wrist, and only lets go when he's satisfied with the pace Izuku walks. This does not happen until they're about to pass Katsuki's neighborhood, relinquishing his grip once they pass the first street leading in. This odd sort of tactility continues the rest of the day. It's not like 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 had previously avoided touching him, or was even particularly affectionate now. But there is still a sense of intimacy that wasn't there before. The wolf having no reservations over fussing over him now. He touches his shoulder or grabs his wrist to get his attention. He sits closer to him at lunch, almost on top of him. It seems like, and each greeting since the previous night's goodbye is now accented by 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's palm on the back of Izuku's neck. If their classmates notice, they don't make anything of it, though this may be in part because of 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's none too subtle threat displays. There's a snicker at Izuku's expense, and suddenly there's a loud, peculiar tapping to interrupt it. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's nails extending into claws and drumming on his desk. Another snicker at 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's ostensible tameness in his presence, and the air around them becomes spiked with the scent of smoke. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 by no means has to go as far as he did before, when he had filled the room with a dizzying pressure and gnashed his teeth like he meant for someone's neck to be between them. But there's still grumbles among their classmates at this change in status quo, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 is only all too happy to meet them head-on. Izuku is surprised, until he remembers what 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 was like before, when they were hardly 4 and 5 and the wolf cub could hardly keep his hands off of him, much in the same manner as he's doing now. He's touched, honestly, barely able to keep from getting misty-eyed until 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 grumbles something to the tune of, "Don't make it weird, Izuku." School ends, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 talks Izuku into coming to his house for training, because as it turns out, learning how to play with fire is safer if you've got a backyard to do it in, as opposed to inside. He's got a point, but there's still some hesitance on 𝐀𝐦's end when Izuku calls and asks. 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 hears Izuku struggling to convince his mom, and says without missing a beat, "Auntie can come, too." Izuku tells her this, but 𝐀𝐦 still says, "That's very nice of him, but that's not the problem, sweetie. The reason we were doing this in the apartment instead of outside was to keep you safe, Izuku," she explains. "It's already warded off so that you wouldn't be detected using your magic. I don't want to attract any unwanted attention to the Bakugos. It wouldn't be fair to them, and it wouldn't be safe for you." 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 at this point has already gone into the house and gotten his mom, and it's at this point that Mitsuki gently but insistently takes the phone from Izuku. She then, gently but insistently, explains to 𝐀𝐦 that it's all right and she understands, but would still very much like for her and Yagi to come over here. That she and Masaru can keep Izuku plenty safe, and that she would very much like 𝐀𝐦 place wards around her home as well. And 𝐀𝐦 says, "Well, as long as you're all right with me placing wards there, too, of course," Mitsuki replies. "That way, it'll be safer and easier for all of us to do it here." So, a bewildered 𝐀𝐦 and Yagi arrive a short time later, with supplies in tow, including all of her needed reagents, another tin of treats baked earlier that week, and Yagi's cloak, wrapped carefully around them in 𝐀𝐦's bag. 𝐀𝐦 unwraps these at the Bakugo's kitchen table, and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 very obviously and hungrily stares at the cookie tin. "Do you want one?" 𝐀𝐦 offers. "No," 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 lies moodily. "We have to train first." Izuku helps his mom and Masaru put up wards on the fence surrounding the house, watching idly as Mitsuki repeatedly slammed 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 onto his back in their sparring. It's fascinating, watching the two slip between their human and wolf skins as smooth as silk. But try as he might, 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 can't seem to make any headway before Mitsuki flips him onto the ground again. Izuku sort of wishes he could stop and take notes, but he figures there will be plenty of other times if this continues. He thinks it might be easier for 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬 if Mitsuki's wolf skin wasn't so much larger than his, twice the size of a normal wolf and 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's own. They both have pale blonde fur and deep red eyes, but that's about where the similarities end. Mitsuki's limbs are long and graceful, and her tail is, too. But 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐬's form looks a little strange for wolf, stockier like a fighting dog, with a shorter tail and eerily hand-like paws. There's a strange texture around his eyes, and from his elbow down on each limb, fur thinner but skin harder, thicker, looking something like reptile scales. Flames leap from his mane and paws, But Mitsuki pays them no mind, still beating her son easily. Izuku hadn't really thought anything of it before. But this is the first time he was seeing Mitsuki's form, and the difference between a full-blooded wolf and a hybrid is stark. Izuku wonders if Katsuki will grow horns, too. After they finish putting up the wards, Yagi inspects them and declares them fully capable of shielding Izuku's magic from sight. Then, they gather round and wait for Mitsuki and Katsuki's sparring to be done before continuing. Izuku can't help himself, this time, and does break out a notebook, scribbling down everything he can before Mitsuki tells Katsuki they're done. Katsuki isn't happy about this, not by a long shot, but she's quick to remind him that Izuku needs to get some practice in, too. "We should probably start you with physical training, too," Mitsuki says. "You need to be able to withstand your own strength and power if you want to be able to tap into it." Katsuki helps him conjure his flame again, but Masaru helps to make it bigger. Masaru helps him steady it and stay calm throughout so that it will not flicker or fade. "The thing you need to know," Masaru says, red flickers dancing between his open fingers, "is that this fire is an extension of yourself. This is your will, and it won't hurt you unless you think it will. This is not something borrowed. This is not something you need to keep at arm's length. This is the expression of your will, and should not be feared by anyone except your enemies. Magic is shaped by intent, demons, fire especially so." Both of Masaru's hands become consumed by flame, and he cards one through his son's hair, much to his chagrin. But it does nothing to Katsuki, except embarrass him. It doesn't smoke, it doesn't catch, it doesn't do much else except warm his scalp. Masaru takes some scrap paper in his other hand, discarded and crumpled into a ball, and it bursts into flame instantly, turning to black ashes in seconds. "This will not hurt anyone unless I say so, because I say so," Masaru tells him. Izuku nods, watching avidly and writing down all that he can. By the end of the night, he manages to make a fireball as big as his fist, but can't hold it for long before it bursts in his hand, exploding in a riot of color and light. It doesn't burn him. It doesn't burn anyone, and Izuku is so relieved. It does, however, leave him exhausted. Mitsuki is probably onto something with that mention of physical training. "I think that's enough for today," Masaru says, just in time for Mitsuki and 𝐀𝐦 to call from inside that dinner is ready. "You did very well, especially considering how late you're blooming," he adds, chuckling. He then turns to Katsuki and says, "You did very well, too, Kaken." "I didn't do anything," Katsuki replies, frowning. He apparently has already forgotten the fact that he kept Izuku tethered to himself so that he would not be lost to his own power, and dragged him back each time he was threatened with being overwhelmed. "You did plenty," he assures him. Katsuki chooses to ignore this and walks inside, grumbling. The worry must show on Izuku's face, because Masaru then says, "Don't worry about him, he's just pouting. He'll get over it." "I can still hear you," he calls from the doorway. Izuku jumps. "Good," Masaru replies. "Then you know you're being ridiculous." Katsuki huffs and continues inside. They follow him shortly after and sit down to eat. It's nice, if a little strange. This is the first time Izuku has been in the Bakugo's home for more than 10 minutes, anyway in about a decade. Things have changed, gotten replaced or worn in, and it feels a little jarring when overlaid with his memory of it. The fridge no longer bears their childhood scrawlings, or any photos of the two of them. But it does have the Bakugo's various achievements pinned to it. Katsuki's good grades, and various fashion shows that his parents have been a part of, or headed themselves. The plates are the same, maybe a little scratched from years of use, and the magnets on the fridge are still kitschy, cartoony, and dog-themed. Mitsuki thought they were hilarious. Masaru and Katsuki tolerated them. Mitsuki and 𝐀𝐦 together made a hearty meal, a stew made with meat and veggies, which is probably good because Katsuki eats like a monster, and the extended use of his magic has made Izuku suddenly, intensely hungry. They don't do much talking. It's mostly the grown-ups doing that while they scarf down their food. However, It gets to a point in dinner where 𝐻𝐡𝐬𝐭 has eaten enough where he slows down, and he regards 𝐬𝐡𝐭 with intent. He definitely wants something, and wants it enough that 𝐬𝐡𝐭 can feel faint echoes of it bleed over through the bond. He's got an idea, but he isn't entirely sure what. 𝐻𝐡𝐭 isn't really one to hide what he wants, however. "You want to sleep over?" he asks. It's more like a grunt, but 𝐬𝐡𝐭 gets the message clear enough. He's excited and touched one moment, and then anxious and guilty in the next, because 𝐻𝐡𝐭 was clearly nervous about this, and wouldn't look him in the eye when he asked. And 𝐬𝐡𝐭 is going to have to tell him no, because he already has training plans for tomorrow. It's his community service day, which means going back to the beach and spending the whole day there cleaning up. His hesitance must show on his face, because it doesn't take long for 𝐻𝐡𝐭 to start crumbling, and then apologize for even bringing it up. "I want to, but I can't," 𝐬𝐡𝐭 explains, trying to clear things up. "I have training first thing tomorrow morning, so I would have to get ready and leave as soon as I woke up." 𝐻𝐡𝐭 nods, and this appears to mitigate some of the hurt. "What are you doing tomorrow?" Mitsuki asks, apparently having been tuned in to their exchange. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 tries to not jump a little in his seat when she starts unexpectedly talking. He knows she's just trying to help, but it's hard to tamp down on his reactions to unanticipated noises. "Maybe we can work something out." 𝐬𝐡𝐭 looks to Yagi for permission, and the man nods amicably, waving him on. "I'm working on cleaning up a beach that's being used as a garbage dump," 𝐬𝐡𝐭 tells her. "So I can better myself and the community," he continues, mimicking the way that Yagi had first said it. "Maybe 𝐻𝐡𝐭 can help," Mitsuki suggests. "𝐬𝐡𝐭 can stay over, and then I can drive them over in the morning." "Are you sure?" Yagi asks. This is really more of an assignment for 𝐬𝐡𝐭. Young Bakugo doesn't have to come along if he doesn't want to. "I can help," 𝐻𝐡𝐭 interrupts, just shy of belligerently. Mitsuki chuckles at her son's outburst. "Looks like he's fine with it," she says, grinning. "Oh, it could help with pack bonding, too. That's technically a kind of community." Mitsuki's grin is infectious, and Yagi can't help grinning back. "I suppose so," he allows, playful. After dinner, Mitsuki drives the Midoriyas and Yagi back to the apartment, and comes back with 𝐬𝐡𝐭, a packed bag, his pillow, and a sleeping bag. 𝐬𝐡𝐭, after some hesitance, decides to bring his favorite comforter as well. It's an old one, and well-loved. Normally, it wouldn't leave his room, so he's a little wary of taking it out of the apartment entirely. But it helped him sleep better if he had something familiar to sleep with. 𝐻𝐡𝐭 has apparently spent the last hour or so it's taken for 𝐬𝐡𝐭 to go back to his apartment, get packed, and drive back, to frantically clean his room. The thing is, however, 𝐻𝐡𝐭 already keeps it meticulously clean, so it mostly amounted to fussing over how things were arranged on his bookshelf, and pacing around the already clean floor agitatedly. "Hi," 𝐬𝐡𝐭 says mildly, but it's enough to interrupt his pacing. "Hey," 𝐻𝐡𝐭 replies stiffly. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 moves to put his stuff down on the floor next to 𝐻𝐡𝐭's bed. "Yeah, you can just put that, yeah." Things are quiet for a few moments. Then, 𝐬𝐡𝐭 asks, "You want to make a pillow fort?" 𝐻𝐡𝐭 looks at him, dumbfounded, but then says, "Sure, yeah." The fort helps smooth things out. It gives them both something to focus on, and small talk eventually gives way to actual conversation. True, it's mostly 𝐻𝐡𝐭 being a fussy perfectionist about where things should go and how things should be set up. But that's about the way it went when they did this as young kids, too, so that makes sense. True to form, 𝐻𝐡𝐭 breaks out smash and demands to play. That lasts a while, but playing as a team becomes nauseatingly easy, and playing against each other is a bitter stalemate. They end up switching over to 𝗵𝗲𝗄 instead, passing the controller back and forth between them for a while. There is an attempt at Pikmin. It does not go well. There is a lot of frantic screaming on both their parts, but 𝐬𝐡𝐭's having fun at least, and he thinks 𝐻𝐡𝐭 is, too. Mitsuki lurks in the doorway for this part, laughing her ass off. They're camped out in the living room, with her and Masaru in the kitchen, so it wasn't exactly difficult to her to pick up on when the chaos started. Izuku has a sneaking suspicion that she's been taking pictures this whole time. They finally pass out around midnight with an animated movie playing on the TV. Izuku had suggested it when Katsuki couldn't think of anything, and the boy wolf rolled his eyes exaggeratedly, but put it on anyway. He stayed awake longer than Izuku to watch it, though, so what's that say about him? Izuku wakes up to the sounds and smells of someone puttering about the kitchen, making breakfast. He also wakes up to Katsuki's hand on his face. Katsuki himself had starfished out sometime during the night, taking up every available inch of space that he could. Izuku carefully untangles himself from the mess of blankets and pillows and pads over to the kitchen to eat. Masaru and Mitsuki are already in there, and each greet him affectionately in turn. Katsuki comes in a minute or so later, just as Izuku is scooping food onto his plate. He squints at Izuku and mumbles something unintelligible under his breath. It's most likely something about Izuku not waking him up right when he woke up, so Izuku just rolls his eyes at him. Katsuki huffs at him, but there's still a hand on the back of Izuku's neck when he finally sits down, too. After breakfast, they set out towards the beach, both of them still relatively quiet and sleepy. Izuku missed this, he realizes, the tranquility of early mornings in the car, sun just above the horizon, wind rushing outside the windows, and Katsuki's quiet companionship next to him. His mom and Yagi are already there by the time they arrive, and Yagi waves them down so Mitsuki sees. Izuku and Katsuki clean up the section Yagi had plotted out for them so much faster than he had been expecting that they ended up just about doubling the amount that Izuku would get done by himself. Yagi isn't quite sure what to have them do. He wasn't expecting them to work together so efficiently, so he has them clean up as much as they can before the truck arrives, just to see exactly what they're capable of. The answer is a lot, apparently. The rest of June goes about this way. The semester finishes up, but Izuku still sees Katsuki every day. This is where his physical training begins, with Katsuki teaching him all that he knows so that Izuku can catch up with him, and then the both of them learning new things when the Bakugos return home. Izuku has plenty to learn from his mother as well. Now that he's home for the summer, Inko has him help her with her commission work. Potions and spells and wards and the like, made to order for various clientele. And of course, there's Yagi, the man who started it all, who still comes over most nights and oversees Izuku's tutelage. The only thing that's different, really, is that Katsuki is now at his side when he works with his mother and Yagi. At the end of June, the full moon comes round again. That night, Izuku leaves the balcony door open for Katsuki, and true to form, the boy wolf appears, his quarry between his jaws and mane wreathed in flame. He drops the deer carcass next to the potted plants and gingerly steps inside. Inko makes him come over to the kitchen sink so she can wash the blood from his muzzle, which he accepts with the usual token protest. He and Izuku curl up in the nest of blankets and pillows on the floor, keeping guard while the wolf's mother continues the hunt outside. When Izuku wakes up, Katsuki is still there, wolf skin shed and human once more. The balcony door is closed, but in the kitchen sits both of their mothers, chatting idly over breakfast. Things continue like this well into July, and Izuku very nearly forgets about his own birthday until his mom asks him what he wants. He doesn't really know what to tell her. At this point, he sort of already has everything he wants. He's still a little scared that if he asks for more than he has, or doesn't cling to it with all his might, it's just going to evaporate into thin air. But his birthday comes, and Izuku comes home from sparring with Katsuki to his tiny apartment being filled to the brim once more, the Bakugos already having arrived, and Yagi and Katsuki coming home with him. There's a cake waiting for him, and dinner already on the table, his favorite, katsudon, and presents waiting for him as well. There are 3 total, each carefully wrapped in colorful paper. The first one is a dark green cloak, painted with deep red patterns around the bottom edge, and slightly lighter red leaf clasp to keep it closed. This was made by his mother and Masaru. Cloth and enchantments both. This will hide you from everyone except Pack, the demon explains. Everyone who would try to find you, whether through scent or scrying or any other kind of magic, will not, unless you allow them to. The second one is a mask in the shape of a black rabbit, its face delicately painted with white. There are seemingly no eye holes, but when Izuku puts the mask up to his face, he still sees through it just fine. The rabbit has been painted with red eyebrow spots, and red makeup underlining its closed eyes. As long as this is on, no one will be able to recall your name unless you give it to them willingly, his mother says. There are many with gifts who could steal you away with your name alone. Do not give it to anyone you would not trust your life with. Lastly, on each cheek is painted 3 green freckles. There's no enchantment in these sometimes. Spots are just spots, and there's nothing wrong with that. The third and final gift is from Yagi. It's a Game of the Year edition of Overwatch. It was young Katsuki's idea, he says with a massive grin, ratting out Katsuki immediately. Katsuki can't quite look Izuku in the eye when Yagi says this, which is fine because Izuku is tearing up a little bit. You were saying how you wanted it, and it was on sale, so, Katsuki explains, a little curt in his awkwardness. His bashfulness ends when the familiar flash of a camera goes off, and he whirls around on his mother and starts screeching at her. As always, Mitsuki cares little for her son's wounded pride, and continues recording the proceedings on her phone. Katsuki stays overnight, and they camp out in Izuku's room and play Overwatch. They're new and horrible at it together, and stay up late into the night, shrieking with delight until 𝐀𝐦 comes and tells them lights out. All in all, Izuku thinks it's a good birthday. The next full moon, Mitsuki suggests that Izuku join the hunt. Her reasoning is that practice and theory is all well and good, but he needs to be put into actual situations to know how and when to apply it. And this would be the safest environment for him to do so, under Mitsuki's watchful eye and with Katsuki by his side. 𝐀𝐦 gives her consent, but requests that Yagi join as well, which is fine by him since that's about what he wanted, too. The night starts off well enough. They meet at the wolves' house a little while before the sun goes down, and prepare themselves for when the moon rises. Mitsuki does her best to explain everything prior to the moon's ascent. It's not that she couldn't while it was up. It was just a little more difficult to keep a hold of her human skin than it would be normally, the beast's skin being handed over the reins fully for once and unwilling to let go. Katsuki hasn't achieved this just yet. He's still a little too susceptible to his base instincts, and probably would be for some time. He's still a young boy, after all. It becomes especially apparent when the last rays of the sun start sinking into the horizon, and Katsuki becomes nonverbal. He's still social, but Izuku would hardly call Katsuki coming up behind him and snuffling his hair with pupils the size of saucers a human behavior. This continues even as he slips into his wolf skin, if not more so. He uses Izuku's shoulders to keep himself balanced as he changes, and Izuku knows that he's done when the nose poking into the back of his head is cold and wet. Izuku laughs at him a bit, and Katsuki growls and bops him right between the shoulder blades with one large paw. Knowing when he's being teased, behave yourself, Mitsuki warns, voice too deep and teeth too large. These are the last threads of her humanity for the night, Izuku suspects. And he's proven right when she shifts as well, not a minute later. Katsuki huffs but obeys his mother, pushing off from Izuku to stand on 4 legs. We'll call you back home if it gets too late, Masaru tells them. In his hand and 𝐀𝐦's are tiny, silver bells. The enchantment emanating from it feels like his mom's work, gentle and loving, seeing a verdant green when his eyes are closed. They must be new. The wolves look at them like they've never seen them before. Katsuki sniffs at one inquisitively, and Mitsuki presses her head into 𝐀𝐦's empty hand, tail wagging. 𝐀𝐦 looks flustered, but complies, scratching behind Mitsuki's ears. Yagi looks a little confused, but curious. This is probably the first time he's seen wolves beneath a full moon and wasn't hunting them. This is also probably the first time that he's hunted with them. Where did their clothing go? He wonders to himself, probably a little louder than he thinks. Enchanted by yours truly, Masaru answers matter-of-factly. They fall away when it comes time to shift, and come back when they shift back. Yagi replies, impressed. Convenient. Necessary, Masaru corrects. Unless they want to either run around naked every full moon or destroy all of their clothing. He looks at Katsuki meaningfully. This one's going to be a pain in the ass once he hits his growth spurt. Katsuki grumbles at him, but Masaru is forgiven when he scratches behind his ears. They set out for their hunt not long after, starting by patrolling the usual places. Typically, first they'll check and make sure that no dangerous creatures have wandered into their territory, however small it may be. But they've hunted in this area so consistently since they've moved in that it's a very rare occurrence. If their search for more challenging quarry turns up fruitless, which it usually does, they'll turn to their next target, the massive deer population. It's no secret that deer have become something of a pest in recent years, with no natural predators left to cull their growing numbers, and so the wolves step in and become those predators. They'll take what they need from their kills and give the rest to 𝐀𝐦 for her work. At first, this is the plan for the night, but as with all things with Izuku, things do not go according to plan. They find no intruders in their domain, and that's all well and good. But they find no quarry either, even as they venture deeper into the woods of the nearby park. It's not as if they aren't here. The wolves can smell them and track them, but they're hiding as if they've never seen a human being before, even though these deer have a markedly lesser fear of humans than their fellows in the countryside. First it's boring, then it's worrisome, and as the night goes on, they become more and more aware of the stark silence surrounding them. No creatures cry out in the night, the owls do not hoot, the frogs do not croak, the crickets do not chirp, and the cicadas do not scream. No sounds echo through the trees save for the ones made by their own feet. Mitsuki leaves them on the deer path they're tracking, stalking into the dark maze of trees around them to see if she can find something, anything. Katsuki continues leading them, but it's clear he's on edge, stands defensive, keeping himself low to the ground and his hackles raised. Yagi keeps Izuku close to himself, one large hand on his shoulder, and keeping him under his cloak. It is much easier than expected for Izuku to tuck himself into Yagi's side. The cloak is spacious and billowing, and the man is tall but lanky, leaving more than enough room for Izuku. Their path is dappled with moonlight, but only just so, the foliage of the trees around them much too thick for it to reach the forest floor. Mitsuki hasn't been gone for long when the trees thin out some, and the pale, bright light above throws the thicket ahead into a harsh contrast. It makes the forest seem alien, more so than the dark by itself does. And it doesn't help at all that something almost completely unrecognizable comes wandering out onto the trail. Katsuki notices it first, a couple seconds before it meanders into their path, stiffening up and growling. But it doesn't take long for Yagi and Izuku to notice it as well. The smell of rotting meat is unmistakable and unbearable. It's tall, and its 4 legs are long and stilt-like, ending in hooves and exposed bone, both made pale in the moonlight. Its head is grotesque, all of the flesh covering where the face likely would have been now gone away, leaving its eerily sharp teeth and the entirety of its jaws visible to the naked eye. The head is mostly bare, stopping right where its tattered ears begin, and wherever the remaining flesh meets the open air are the swaying tendrils of curious, bioluminescent fungi, growing throughout its skeleton and poking through wherever the skin has split apart. Its antlers are warped and numerous, twisted in on themselves like vines, and there are too many holes in its head, too many eye sockets emptied of flesh, only to be filled with more of the little glowing tendrils, something black and viscous dripping from the open wounds. The tendrils are moving too precisely for it to be mindless. There's some flesh left, but not much, certainly nowhere near what it should be, and what remains seems to hang off of the animate bones, as if it wasn't fitted correctly. Maybe it was a deer at one point, But it certainly isn't now. Its limbs are stretched beyond what the limits of the animal should be, shape malformed and uncanny. Worse yet, there's some unnerving glow to it, beyond what light the moon shines on it, and the tendrils. Izuku can see the glowing mass of fungi taking up most of its chest cavity, lighting it from within, and the outline of its ribs through the dangling, rotting skin hanging off of its body. It doesn't do anything at first. None of them do. Izuku doesn't move, he doesn't breathe, he doesn't do anything except stand there, half hidden in Yagi's cloak, while the man clutches him against himself and Katsuki holds his position in front of them and snarls, sparks flaring from his hackles. He can barely hear it over his own heart, pounding hard in chest, and he has the irrational thought that the once deer can hear it too. "What?" he hears himself murmur. "What is that?" I don't know," Yagi replies, stunned. It turns its head, facing them now, and Izuku goes numb with dread. He understands now why no other creature roamed the forest. Not when this was in their midst. It starts lumbering towards them, and seeing it move is so much worse than seeing it be still. Its movements are stiff and unnatural, the creature a puppet with unseen strings. Katsuki lunges, but Yagi is faster. He grabs him by the scruff of his neck and hisses in a dire whisper, "No," and then, "Don't touch it." And Izuku agrees. There is something unknowably awful its very presence screaming infection and corruption. He has no idea how he didn't notice it before. The magic radiating off it as glaring and alarming as the fluorescent warning colors on a poisonous animal. Yagi starts backing away, taking Izuku and a reluctant Katsuki with him. And it follows, tendrils waving towards them, and Izuku acts without thinking. He cannot let that thing, whatever it is, come any closer. He cannot let it spread its obvious sickness to his family, to his pack. And it's barely a thought in his head when a fireball gathers in his fist, all of his body buzzing with energy and impulse. It crackles and flashes, green and iridescent, and just as Yagi asks, "Izuku, what are you doing?" it launches from his open palms, the kickback knocking him further into Yagi's side. It smashes into the thing's skull, bursting into sparks that wash over its body. But all this seems to do is force it to pause a moment. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to have taken damage, or even notice it at all. Izuku's fire dissipates in a matter of seconds, and the only thing left of it is an errant spark or two, drifting around the creature's head. For a moment, Izuku thinks, this is it. This is how he's going to die. But he pushes himself through it, pushes down that anxious dread, and thinks, no. He thinks, stubbornly, spitefully, this is not how I'm going to die. This is not how my family will die. Izuku will do everything he can, consequences be damned. And they'll live and this creature will never endanger his family again. Then, one of those errant sparks catches on one of its many tendrils. It sticks for a moment, then fades, but then the moment passes, and it bursts into flames. The green flame spreads fast, turning blindingly bright and devouring the once deer and its infestation. It lets out an unearthly screech, thrashing, stumbling towards them. But it gets no further before Yagi quickly raises his hand, palm out, and the winds around them, so still the entire evening, suddenly whistle around them. Yagi's magic feels strange, heavy, so sudden and abrupt that the weight of it seems to pull him in. It only grows denser in the fractions of seconds he gathers it in his palm. A focusing point. And the sudden shift in pressure has Izuku's ears ringing. Yagi draws his hand back, the force of it pulling Izuku to him like a magnet, and the air between them stretched taut with a power Izuku cannot see. The winds howl around Yagi's fist, and when he launches it forward, only a scarce few moments since Izuku's fire caught on the creature's flesh, something snaps between them and the creature as if releasing a bowstring. The howling winds burst forth from Yagi's fist, spiraling into the creature in a focused blast, and slice it to shreds. Its remains fall to the ground, smoldering, as Izuku's fire determinedly consumes it right to the last scrap of rotten flesh, until only shards of bone remain, popping and cracking apart. The use of Yagi's magic has left Izuku feeling too light for his own body, as if he'll drift off into the sky at any moment. And he swears he can smell ozone. He can taste electricity under his tongue and behind his teeth. It is at that point that Mitsuki comes tearing through the trees, undoubtedly hearing the creature's wretched screech. Her hackles are raised and her teeth are set in a fearsome sneer when she breaks through the thicket, snarling, growling. But upon seeing its remains, she uncurls her lip and makes her way over to them. She doesn't take her eyes off it once, even as it splinters into smaller and smaller pieces. Yagi seems to have calmed enough to release Katsuki from his hold, and the boy wolf stalks forward, examining their fallen foe. Yagi's eyes are still gleaming with sparks of lightning, blue and bright, and a warning of the coming storm. Mitsuki ducks her head under his cloak and drags Izuku out by his own green one, impatiently ushering him onto her back. Yagi gets the message before Izuku does, the boy still a little shaken, picking him up and placing him on his wolf mother's back. There's something dark dripping from Yagi's mouth. He pushed himself too far again. Mitsuki runs back to the house, Izuku on her back and Katsuki running alongside her. Yagi takes to the wind and shadows, as he always does, and keeps pace alongside them, unseen but for the glint of his blue eyes. Izuku isn't really sure how he's managing to hold on at this point, teeth clenched and fingers numb as he twists them in her fur. They take the children and leave them at the house, with no conquest, no prize. Yagi tells them what happened in the woods, when Mitsuki ran into the trees and a living nightmare came stumbling out of them. Neither 𝐀𝐻 nor Masaru are pleased, and the demon leaves with his wife and the magician to scour the woods once more, to make sure that the creature and any of its ilk were well and truly gone. 𝐀𝐻 keeps a vigil at the house until they return, burning incense and lighting candles. She sits in the kitchen, one eye on the front door and one hand around the silver bell. Izuku tries to stay up with her, but he's drained and can't keep his eyes open for more than another hour or two, despite the fear creeping under his skin. Katsuki stays awake, but it's out of dread, hackles raised, growling at every unexpected noise. The hunting party doesn't return until dawn. Izuku wakes when the first few sunbeams stream through the windows, rising from the living room sofa just as the front door opens and Mitsuki, tired and filthy, but unmistakably human, steps through. Katsuki is sleeping at the other end of the sofa, human as well. He must have passed out not much longer after Izuku did. They found no more of the once deer, but no other animal either. Masaru ensured the destruction of its bones, and that's all they can do, for now. That morning and that day are spent recovering. There are no lessons and no sparring. It leaves Izuku feeling restless and useless, and he can only assume Katsuki feels the same, the boy even more irritable than usual. They hole up in Katsuki's room in a nest of blankets and pillows and play Minecraft for a while, sleeping on and off, and it helps, sort of, while the grown-ups downstairs continue to discuss what happened. Katsuki seems to still be working off the moon's influence. He doesn't let Izuku stray too far from him, and is reluctant to let him leave the makeshift den they've made of his room. Izuku tolerates it, for now. The misplaced doting is welcome, and the warmth of Katsuki's room is a shelter he's not willing to leave just yet. 𝐀𝐻 checks on them every once in a while, and brings them food and comfort when she can. It isn't until around dinner that Masaru calls them down and coerces them into settling into the living room instead. He puts on a movie for them to watch, something light and fun and mindless to help them forget, at least a little bit. Yagi settles on the couch next to them, having been bullied into the living room by the Bakugos. His presence helps, and Izuku finally manages to doze off without suddenly jerking awake for the first time all day. That night, Mitsuki goes out again, alone this time. She doesn't stay out too long, just long enough to return to those woods and do one last sweep. She comes back in her wolf skin and a large buck clenched between her jaws, and she, her husband, and 𝐀𝐻 cut and prepare the meat for meals to come. 𝐻𝐸 gets sent home with a much larger portion of meat than he'd asked for. The 𝗵𝘃 goes on to him and his less than stellar self-care. And 𝐴𝐻𝐸 gets sent home with its horns, teeth, and bones. 𝐘𝐧𝐸 walks them back, even if he doesn't seem to want to let them go. Their goodbye is accented with 𝐘𝐧𝐸's palm on Izuku's neck, much longer than usual, and his seemingly grudging acceptance of 𝐴𝐻𝐸 hugging him. This appears to help a lot, however, judging by how he reciprocates just a bit too much for it not be earnest. Izuku forgets sometimes, when 𝐘𝐧𝐸 so proudly wears his wolf skin, that he's just a boy, like him, 15 and scared and angry. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 gives him a kiss on the forehead, and 𝐘𝐧𝐸 pretends he isn't starving for the reassurance that his pack, his family, is still there, and still breathing. A few weeks later, 𝐻𝐸 brings Izuku into work with him. He asks about it about a week after the incident with the not deer, when it was finally moving away from the forefront of everyone's minds. It's a Sunday, and they're at the beach again. Izuku and 𝐘𝐧𝐸 are moving a little slower than they usually do, and their parents are a little quieter than they usually are, but they're moving on steadily. 𝐻𝐸 pulls Izuku aside, while 𝐴𝐻𝐸 and the 𝗵𝘃 get a picnic set up for lunch. "I know everyone's still kind of shaken up over what we saw that night," 𝐻𝐸 says. "But given the circumstances, I think you handled it very well." "Really?" Izuku asks, bashful, craving the compliment. "Not many can think as quick on their feet as you do, young Izuku," 𝐻𝐸 laughs. "And with this, and how your control over your magic has been improving, I think you're ready to accompany me while I fulfill my duties as a guardian." Izuku's eyes go wide. "Really?" he asks again, slightly too high-pitched. He attempts to force himself calm, but it doesn't really work all that well. 𝐻𝐸 hums a yes, nodding. "I still have to talk to your mother about it, but yes," he confirms. "I'll do it when we get home tonight." Izuku wonders, affection surging, if he knows what it is exactly he said. He doesn't ruin the moment by bringing it up. Needless to say, his mother agreed under the usual stipulation, which was, of course, to keep Izuku safe, and around 2 weeks later, 𝐻𝐸 has a place and time for them to go. The man has been notoriously independent as a guardian, with very little exception. But for Izuku to become a guardian himself, it is almost entirely certain he'll be working with a more experienced guardian's agency at one point or another, especially if he manages to get into UA. So 𝐻𝐸 called up a couple of his fellow guardians to see if their agency would be willing to host them for the day, and succeeded after some time, effort, and scheduled juggling. Surprisingly or not so surprisingly, he supposes it makes sense for the highest-rated guardians to know each other in some way or another. Todoroki Enji is the one to accept. Maybe Izuku was right to be surprised at first, because 𝐻𝐸 seems to be a little surprised by it, too. "I haven't spoken to him in years," he admits a little sheepishly. "I knew it was kind of a long shot, but I still consider him my friend and colleague despite that." Maybe he does, too. Upon meeting the man, Izuku can honestly say no. He does not in any capacity consider 𝐻𝐸 to be his friend, and he's not sure how 𝐻𝐸 didn't see it before. The morning of their departure begins with 𝐻𝐸 coming to get Izuku that morning, and then them heading over to the agency via train. Izuku keeps his cloak and mask in his backpack until they get close, but they have no trouble getting by unnoticed, so much so that he can't help be somewhat suspicious. No one seems to take notice of them until spoken to directly, and even then, they're terribly surprised. 𝐻𝐸 accidentally spooks the conductor on the train so much that they just about hit the ceiling, and after apologizing, explains to Izuku that yes, there is some magic at play here. "It's just easier for me to get around this way," he says. "It doesn't that much effort, so it won't hurt me to do it long enough for us to get there." "How are you doing this?" Izuku says, impressed and curious. "It's the same gift that lets me blend in with the shadows," 𝐻𝐸 replies. "I'm putting a veil over us, so to speak, so no one will see us unless I want them to. It's not the same as disappearing fully. If someone looks hard enough, they'll know we're there. But for the most part, people don't look. They don't notice because they don't care to. Think of it as a literal version of hiding in plain sight. Their stop is a few blocks from the agency, and when they get off, 𝐻𝐸 directs them over to a little side alley to equip their disguises. He throws on his red cloak, throws up the lion hood, and grows to fill out its broad shoulders. He helps Izuku pin the clasp on his own green one, and makes sure the rabbit mask is fastened correctly before taking off again. He scoops Izuku in one arm easily, tucking him against his side under the red cloth. "Hold on tight," he says. "What?" Izuku says. And then suddenly they're a dozen stories up and soaring over the streets and buildings, while Izuku clings for dear life to 𝐻𝐸's tunic. The winds carry them effortlessly to their destination, and they gently float down to the sidewalk in front the agency. It takes Izuku a moment after they've landed, and after he's collected himself to realize that they're starting to attract a crowd. There's some excited titters and cheers, no doubt from 𝐻𝐸's presence, but it quiets suddenly when he lets Izuku down and the boy comes in full view of everyone. The chatter picks up again after a minute, but by that time, one of Todoroki's apprentices has come to greet them at the gate. The agency building is massive, far larger than Izuku had imagined. He knew that it was big, from images he's seen of it, but it was quite different seeing it in person. It's the very definition of sleek and modern, and well-deserving as its status as one of the top agencies in Japan. The apprentice that met them at the gate takes them to the top floor via elevator, to what appears to be Todoroki's office. There's a large desk at the other end of the room, and in the center are some chairs and a sofa set around a coffee table. The room is incredibly spacious, feeling a little bit more like a conference hall than an office for one man. But it belongs only to Todoroki. Nonetheless, standing next to the desk is a boy that appears to be around Izuku's age, hair split red and white right down the middle, and with a large, pinkish mark covering a little less than half the left side of his face. It isn't until they're closer that Izuku realizes that it is almost certainly a scar, and that two little horns are poking out of his hairline. The one on the left side is smaller and little misshapen, presumably stunted by whatever gave him that scar. More noticeable, however, is the sheer coldness emanating from the boy's expression. His stance is stiff, his fists are clenched, and he glances at them only briefly before resuming his dead-eyed stare, brushing them off with an air of resignation. Todoroki himself is standing with his back to them, on the far side of the room, staring out the window. His attire is sleek and form-fitting, just as modern as the rest of the room, and his presence is every bit as huge and commanding as he is. Izuku is equal parts intimidated and starstruck. Maybe not as much as when he met 𝐻𝐸 the first time, but very few things reach that point for him, and this is still pretty close, comparatively. "Todoroki," 𝐻𝐸 exclaims, voice booming. "It's been a while, hasn't it? How have you been?" He strides towards him, arms out like he's greeting an old friend. But Todoroki doesn't answer at first, continuing to watch the city below. He's notoriously hot-blooded, being that he's gifted with dragon's fire. But Izuku was under the impression that he had some measure of affection for 𝐻𝐸. Why would he let him come to his agency otherwise? Todoroki takes a moment to answer, only slightly inclining his head towards them, eyes narrowing when he catches sight of 𝐻𝐸. He finally notices Izuku, and turns his head fully to look him over. Izuku swallows nervously, thankful for the mask covering his face. But Todoroki doesn't seem to be impressed either way, turning his uninterested gaze back to 𝐻𝐸. "You've got a lot of nerve, calling me up like that," he says after another moment or two. 𝐻𝐸 blinks at him, a little confused, but Todoroki continues before he can speak up. "Who do you think you are, calling me and asking for favors like we're old friends?" Izuku, without moving his head, glances towards the other boy. The other boy doesn't appear to be looking at anything still, and somehow appears stiffer and colder than he did before. Izuku glances back at Todoroki, and with his face turned towards them, he can see the dragon's horns growing tall and strong from his forehead. "I almost hung up on you just on principle. But I wanted to see what sort of apprentice 𝐽𝐬 the Lion-Hearted would take on. I wanted to see how they would stack up against my son. His eyes flick back to Izuku for a moment. I can see now I had nothing to worry about, he says, with a casual sort of coldness. 𝐽𝐬 looks taken aback. He quickly looks between Todoroki and the boy. Your son, he asks, trailing off. Todoroki smirks at him, and finally deigns to walk over to them. Yes, he says. Let me introduce you. The closer he gets, the more the boy his son seems to shrink in on himself. Todoroki slaps a heavy hand onto his left shoulder. Not enough force to actually hurt. But the boy still flinches minutely, like he's trying to stop it before it happens, but can't quite get it entirely. Izuku recognizes it. It mirrors his own a little too closely for him not to. A lot of things are lining up in his head that he's not sure that he likes. This is my son, Todoroki 𝐬𝐬, the dragon says. I have taken him on as my apprentice because he is the worthiest of my children. 𝐽𝐬 makes a weird face at that, but is trapped by social convention and is forced to continue on. This is my apprentice, he says. We refer to them by their title, Black Rabbit. They talked about that, too, before they left. The title you give yourself was almost as important as your true name. But the only sway it holds is expectation. So the three of them, 𝐽𝐬, Inko, and Izuku, decided on this something meek, something demure, something unexpected. Todoroki squints at him. Why, he asks, though it's barely phrased as a question. It is unwise and unsafe to give out one's true name so freely, 𝐽𝐬 replies, not unkindly. There are too many creatures who could do too much harm with true name alone. Todoroki scoffs at him. Still stuck in the old ways, I see, he says, smiling in a way that does not belie any sort of kindness. My apprentice is strong enough to protect himself, even from those bogeymen you still fear. A pity yours isn't. He releases his son from his grip and walks back to the window. 𝐬𝐬, he says, calling his son to attention, even though he no longer looks at them. Show them how a real agency is run. 𝐬𝐬, betraying only the slightest hint of exasperation, replies with a curt, yes, father, and proceeds to walk right past them to the door. He doesn't wait for them, or hold it open for them, just continues on through. 𝐽𝐬 and Izuku walk quickly to catch up, but Izuku peeks back at Todoroki one last time. The man has returned to his previous position at the window, staring out of it onto the city below. He seems to have disregarded them completely. This way, 𝐬𝐬 says, dragging him back to the situation at hand. The tour is one of the most awkward things Izuku has ever had to endure. Barring Todoroki's bizarre and frankly infuriating reception, 𝐬𝐬 is still profoundly stiff around them, and makes for an unenthused, uninspired tour guide. It's not as nearly as bad as it was when he was near his father, but it's still apparent that he has no idea what to say to them. The feeling is mutual, at least as far as 𝐽𝐬 goes, but Izuku does his best to be cordial, all the same. They're partway to the first stop of the tour when Izuku tries to reintroduce himself. Hey, I don't think we were properly introduced back there, let's start over, he starts, trotting in front of 𝐬𝐬. He holds out a gloved hand for 𝐬𝐬 to take, grinning wide under his mask. I'm Black Rabbit, he says, with as much cheer as he can muster. It's nice to meet you. 𝐬𝐬 blinks at him. I'm 𝐬𝐬, he says. He looks down at Izuku's hand, and after a moment of consideration, takes it. Izuku shakes it. It's a little bit like shaking hands with a dead fish. His hand is cold and a little clammy, and the boy doesn't make nearly the same effort that Izuku does, holding on limply while Izuku's enthusiasm guides the action. When Izuku finally slows, he retracts his hand and continues on his way. Izuku refuses to be discouraged by this. It must be really cool to work for an agency, he says, trotting alongside the other boy to keep up. I bet you've already learned a whole bunch from it. 𝐬𝐬 gives him a slightly confused look. I guess, he allows. He doesn't say anything else. Izuku is dying. This is the first time I've ever been to one, he continues, undaunted. What's it like? 𝐲𝐻𝐻's confused frown deepens. That's what I'm trying to show you, right now, he replies, probably a little colder than he means. Father asked me to show you both around, and that's what I'm doing. I'm not asking him, though I'm asking you, Izuku points out. If I wanted to ask him, I would have done it when we were still talking to him. I'm asking you. This only seems to confuse him more, but his expression opens. His walking slows, and his stance becomes more relaxed. Oh, 𝐲𝐻𝐻 says, and not much more than that. But it's a start, at least. The rest of the day continues like that, with lots of stilted, start and stop conversations between Izuku and 𝐲𝐻𝐻, with Izuku doing most of the starting and 𝐲𝐻𝐻 doing most of the stopping. He's not cold deliberately. Izuku comes to learn just a bit socially awkward. But each time Izuku engages him becomes easier and easier, and he likes to think the other boy's mood is lifting, slowly but surely. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 seems genuinely surprised and intrigued that Izuku is taking sincere interest in him, and not just his guardian father. He doesn't have much to say about himself, and when Izuku asks, 𝐲𝐻𝐻 gives very little answer. Izuku has no idea what he does in his spare time, or if he gets any spare time at all. All he seems to do is train with his father, and Izuku isn't entirely sure if it's voluntary or not. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 seems proud of his personal accomplishments one moment, and the next is quietly seething over something Izuku says, and Izuku has no idea of what it could be, other than the vague assumption that the boy's father had something to do with it. The only solid piece of information that he's been able to confirm is that 𝐲𝐻𝐻, like him, hopes to go to 𝐸𝐴. His relationship with his father seems strained at best. It seems that any mention of him sends 𝐲𝐻𝐻's willingness to communicate with Izuku a couple steps backwards. But they manage to get through the tour, and the day, just fine, at least until it's about time for them to leave. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 is leading them back to the entrance when they get headed off by one of Todoroki's many apprentices. Todoroki-kun, they call. Your father said to meet him back in his office once you're done with this. And just like that, he shudders in on himself, looking cagey and evasive once more. His eyes go cold again, and his expression goes carefully blank when he nods to them in reply. Izuku recognizes the feeling too well, and can't leave it alone. Thanks for showing us around today, he says, getting 𝐲𝐻𝐻's attention on him again. I had a lot of fun talking with you and stuff. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 doesn't come back out of his shell, but he doesn't look quite so angry, at least. It's no trouble, he assures Izuku a little stiffly. No, I mean it, thank you, Izuku asserts. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 nods again rapidly. Izuku probably isn't going to get anything else out of him, but he's going to try. I hope I see you at 𝐸𝐴, Izuku tells him. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 just looks surprised again, like he doesn't believe him, but he replies. Yeah, and then, me too. See you later, Izuku says, a promise. See you, 𝐲𝐻𝐻 replies, a little unsure of himself, but hopeful. Izuku waves at him as they leave, and receives a small wave in return. Outside, Yagi waits until they're maybe 10 feet from the door before he says, Wow, that was horrible. Izuku snorts. I'm sorry, Izuku, I would never have taken us here if I'd known Todoroki was going to act like that, he apologizes. Is he always like that? The boy asks. No, Yagi replies, a little indignantly. Not the last time I talked with him, anyway. He used to actually be a rational human being, not whatever arrogant beast we saw in there. He groans annoyedly, and then sighs. You want to get some ice cream on the way back? He asks. Izuku breaks into an excited grin. Okay, he replies. The next couple of patrols do better. Izuku actually gets to go on patrol, for one, instead of being talked down to by someone Yagi thought to be a colleague, but turned out to be a massive fucking asshole, as Katsuki had called him when they had come home and told everyone what happened. He'd called him a couple of other things, too, in a fit of rage that almost had him taking on his wolf skin, sparks flaring from his hair, teeth growing larger and sharper. They didn't need to be repeated, and also made Yagi cough up half a lung, while Mitsuki cackled away. The patrols are calm for the most part. Usually, Izuku doesn't have to do a thing, as far as combat goes. Yagi dispatches every assailant they encounter with so little effort that it's terrifying. They very rarely encounter anything so serious that it takes more than a few minutes to take care of them. Izuku usually keeps watch over any civilians nearby, keeping them calm and soothed. He tends to the wounded, he helps them escape, and paints himself safe and protective, quick and clever. The Black Rabbit is a much easier mask to don than he expected, though he supposes that that's because it's less a mask and more of a reflection of himself in its simplest form. The patrols take up a huge chunk of his week, now that Yagi feels that Izuku is capable of them. He doesn't get to see Katsuki as nearly as much as he did when the summer first started, and he can tell that it bothers the young wolf, no matter how hard he tries to keep it to himself. He's usually the first one to fuss besides 𝐀𝐦 if Izuku gets hurt, but only grumbles that he should be more careful, not that he should stop. Unlike 𝐀𝐦, who reminds Izuku occasionally that if he wants, he can stop anytime. Surprisingly, the ones that are the most supportive are actually the wolf's mother and father. Mitsuki always lavishes him with praise, and Masaru usually just nods approvingly, or gives him pointers when Izuku tells them what happened. However, there is one patrol that throws Yagi and everyone for a loop, so much so that Izuku has no choice but to step in. They're at almost the end of their shift, and decide to stop at a convenience store to pick up some minor things 𝐀𝐦 had requested on the way home. They'd entered and immediately gravitated to the dairy section to get some milk. But before they could even get there, another guest suddenly pulled a gun on the cashier. Their face is obscured by equal parts the hoodie they were wearing and their hair, and Izuku could see no trace of emotion, no fear or desperation when Yagi turned to them. No, Izuku can feel it radiating off them, like a cornered animal, and when Yagi took a step forward to stop them, they cocked the gun, not moving it from its position pointed at the cashier. Yagi froze, as did every other guest present in the store, unable to step forward without putting the cashier's life in danger. They start screaming at the cashier to start piling money into a bag held out in their other hand. But the cashier doesn't even manage to unlock the register before Izuku takes one stupid step forward. He paints himself demure and delicate, and speaks softly but firmly. "You don't want to do this," he tells them, voice somehow still managing to carry across the store. Their head whips around to look at him, gun pointed dead between his eyes, but Izuku keeps the knee-jerk fear it inspires to himself, doing his best to radiate sympathy and serenity. "Don't come any closer," they hiss at him threateningly. Izuku doesn't move and takes a deep breath. "Please," he says again. "You don't have to do this. It's not too late." He takes another step forward, and they flinch, but don't shoot. He takes another, and they still don't shoot. He takes another, and another, and another, and soon he stood next to their would-be robber, slowly lowering his hands. Up close, they're wild-eyed and fearful, looking every bit the cornered animal they're surely feeling like right now. "I'm not going to hurt you," he tells them. "Nobody is going to hurt you." He warily reaches out a hand and grabs not their pistol, but their arm, gently making them lower the weapon. They're trembling under his small, calloused hand. "You don't have to do this," he tells them, one last time, and the words leave his mouth like a punch to the gut. It seems, the not robber suddenly breathless, the gun falling out of their limp hand. Yagi is there in an instant, and he's caught between proud and furious, crushing the pistol in his fist. The metal crumples as if it were aluminum, and he drops it from his smoking fist. "I'll take it from here," he tells Izuku a little brusquely, anger in every line of his body. He slips between Izuku and the assailant easily, grabbing each of their arms with both of his massive hands. His blue eyes have flared up painfully bright, and despite himself, he can't quite keep that anger in. "I'm not going to hurt you," Yagi tells them, smiling through gritted teeth. They don't believe him one bit, and neither does Izuku. But it's a promise he doesn't break, so despite his rage, the assailant doesn't even bruise under his firm grip. The threat is enough. The cashier must have set off an alarm of some sort when they weren't looking at her, because the police arrive within moments of Izuku disarming the assailant. They swarm the store and have taken the not robber away in cuffs before Izuku has even realized what's happened. Too distracted by the crowd suddenly gathered outside the store. The police are doing their best to keep them away, but that doesn't stop them from whipping out their phones, or the multiple news reporters from bullying their way to the front. They're shouting questions at 𝐻𝐻𝐬 while he tries to give his statement to the police. But he doesn't appear to have the patience for them right now, ignoring them while he speaks, and keeping Izuku close to his side. Izuku isn't under the cloak again, but he might as well be, for all that 𝐻𝐻𝐬 tries. The reporters seem to be especially interested in him, but 𝐻𝐻𝐬 has no interest in speaking with them whatsoever, and every passing moment of them pelting questions at him seems to make him angrier and angrier in ways they don't really notice. In fact, the only ones who really notice seem to be Izuku, who is almost certain that 𝐻𝐻𝐬 is about to launch them both into the air again any second now, and the officer speaking to him, who can very clearly 𝐻𝐻𝐬's tight-fisted grip around Izuku's shoulder, and the way he's been clutching him to his side closer and closer. The officer lets them go after a short while, and says they'll contact 𝐻𝐻𝐬 if they need anything else from him. 𝐻𝐻𝐬, true to form, then proceeds to launch them both into the air after saying goodbye in his usual fashion, a thunderous laugh that could be heard from blocks away. No one can apparently hear the notes of furious intent being threaded through it, so they cheer rather than quail like Izuku does. They land on a rooftop not too far away. Izuku doesn't recognize the building, but he supposes it doesn't matter. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 lets him down, and it takes him a moment to regain his balance. Izuku, 𝐻𝐻𝐬 starts, and the sheer amount of restraint he's exerting is honestly a little frightening. What you did back there was very, very brave and very, very foolish. I am proud of you. But, he takes a calming breath. Never do that again, 𝐻𝐻𝐬 tells him. But, no, Izuku. Not this time, he continues before Izuku can protest further. You are 15, and they had a gun. You could have been seriously hurt. You are not to put yourself into danger unnecessarily anymore. Izuku frowns, feeling minimized and childish. All right, he concedes, staring at his feet. Izuku, look at me, 𝐻𝐻𝐬 says, firm but gentle. Grudgingly, he does, and 𝐻𝐻𝐬 leans down, pulling him into his arms. Do not misunderstand me. I'm proud of you, and I am happy to see the sort of guardian you will become. But it's not time yet. You have a little more growing up to do. You're not ready just yet. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 pauses, stroking his fingers through Izuku's hair. I'm not ready just yet, he admits after a moment. I don't know what I would have done if I'd have lost you back there. You're the closest thing to family I have. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 gives him one last, tight squeeze. We'll get there when we get there, all right? 𝐻𝐻𝐬 tells him. Don't act so recklessly. You have people who want you to come home. Okay, Izuku warbles, eyes watering. Naturally, when they return home that night, Izuku is greeted with a chorus of, Izuku, what the fuck? I was so worried, Izuku. You are in big trouble, young man. Because as it turns out, his shenanigans in the convenience store turned up on the news that night. And the Bakugos, knowing how worried 𝐀𝐻𝐬 would be, hunkered down in the apartment with her and kept watch until they returned. And his mothers, Witch and Wolf both, were there to greet him when he did, as was his demon father. And the one to open the door and let him in, to drag him in with shaking hands, snarling the whole way, was Katsuki. Because 𝐻𝐻𝐬 was right. Of course, there were people waiting for him to return home.